There is a mountain range in Western Canada that has never fully given up its secrets. You can drive through it on a highway built less than a century ago, staring out at walls of stone that rise so high above the road they seem to lean over you, and you will feel something that is difficult to name. It is not just the scale of the place, though the scale is staggering. It is something older than that feeling. Something that makes the back of your neck go tight and your eyes drift toward the shadows in the rock face and wonder, without quite knowing why you are wondering what is behind them. The Canadian Rockies have been studied, mapped, photographed and climbed for over 200 years. Scientists have catalogued their geology, measured their glaciers, traced their rivers back to their high mountain sources, and yet in the past several years, scanning technology that did not exist a generation ago has been pointed at the deepest foundations of those mountains, and what it has returned has quietly unsettled a number of the researchers who reviewed the data. There are structures beneath the stone, there are passages, not random fractures, not the ordinary dissolution cavities that form in limestone over millions of years, but formations that follow patterns. Formations that branch and reconnect. Formations that in some cases lead to chambers whose dimensions would be difficult to explain through any purely geological process that mainstream science currently recognizes. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The data did not come from one source. That is the first thing that makes it difficult to set aside. Researchers from 3 separate institutions, working independently and with different equipment, focused their instruments on different sections of the range, and all 3 returned results that pointed toward the same general conclusion. Something is there. Something that has been there for a very long time. Something that does not appear on any geological survey conducted before these recent scans were taken. The question of what it is, how it formed, and whether human hands had any role in its creation is the question that has been quietly circulating in a small number of academic circles, and occasionally leaking out into the wider world in fragments, in footnotes, in the kind of careful language that scientists use when they want to say something significant without committing to a conclusion that their colleagues might reject. This is the story of what those scans found. But it is also a much older story than that, because the mountains themselves are old in ways that make every human civilization look like an afternoon. And the people who lived near those mountains, who moved through them, who built their understanding of the world around their stone faces and hidden valleys, they carried knowledge about the Rockies that the scientists with their ground-penetrating radar and their seismic tomography equipment are only now beginning to approach from a different direction. The knowledge from below and the knowledge from above are, in some cases, beginning to point toward the same place. To understand what the scans found, you first need to understand what the Canadian Rockies actually are. Not in the tourist brochure sense, not in the sense of postcard lakes and summer hiking trails, but in the geological sense, which is stranger and more violent than most people realize. These mountains were not always here. The rock that forms them was once sediment, lying at the bottom of a warm, shallow sea that covered much of western North America. That sea existed for hundreds of millions of years. The sediment accumulated in layers, compressing under its own weight into limestone and shale and sandstone, building up a record of life and time that is almost incomprehensibly deep. Then, roughly 80 million years ago, the tectonic forces that govern the movement of continents began pushing the Pacific plate against the edge of North America, with a pressure that nothing on the surface of this planet can match. The seafloor folded. It buckled and cracked and thrust upward in sheets, one layer sliding over another in what geologists call thrust faults, enormous slabs of rock the size of small countries moving horizontally and vertically at the same time. The Canadian Rockies are not mountains that grew up from below. They are mountains that were shoved sideways and piled on top of each other, which means their internal structure is layered in ways that run against the horizontal. Older rock sits on top of younger rock in places. Entire mountain ranges are essentially enormous slabs that slid dozens of miles from their original position. This history matters enormously to what the scans found, because it means the interior of the Canadian Rockies is shot through with the boundaries between these sliding layers. Thrust planes, they are called. And along those thrust planes, over millions of years, water moved. It dissolved limestone. It carved passages. It created the kind of labyrinthine interior that is extremely difficult to map from the surface, because the passages follow the lines of ancient geological movement rather than the logic of simple gravity. They go horizontal for long distances. They climb upward through a mountain rather than always descending. They follow the paths that water took through layers of rock that were themselves moving at the time the passages were being carved. The scanning technology that has been applied to the Rockies in recent years uses a combination of methods. Ground-penetrating radar works at shallow depths, sending electromagnetic pulses into the rock and reading the reflections that bounce back when they hit a boundary between different materials. A void in the rock reflects differently than solid stone. A water-filled passage reflects differently again. Seismic tomography works at much greater depths, using either natural seismic activity or controlled detonations to send sound waves through the rock, and then reading how those waves arrive at sensors placed at various distances. The speed at which the waves travel and the way they bend and slow allows researchers to build a three-dimensional picture of what is inside a mountain without ever touching the interior. Both methods have limitations. Both can be fooled by complex geology. Both require experienced interpretation to distinguish a natural void from an artificial one, a random fracture from a shaped passage. The researchers who have been working on the Rocky Mountain data are careful about all of this. They do not claim certainty, they claim anomaly. They claim that what they are seeing does not match what they expected to see based on the known geology of the range, and that some of what they are seeing is difficult to explain through purely natural processes. The anomalies cluster in specific areas. The first and most discussed cluster lies beneath a section of the range in what is now Banff National Park, in the deep stone beneath the region around the Bow Valley. The second cluster is further north, in the Jasper area, beneath the Columbia Icefield, and extending south and east toward the Athabasca River Valley. The third, and in some ways the most puzzling, is in the southern Rockies near the border with Montana, in an area that sits close to the traditional territories of several First Nations groups whose oral traditions include references to underground places of significant spiritual and practical importance. The passages in the Bow Valley cluster range in estimated width from a few meters to what the seismic data suggests may be chambers of significant size, possibly 30 meters or more across in some locations. They connect in ways that suggest a network rather than a collection of isolated features. They trend in a generally northeast-southwest orientation that follows the major thrust faults of the region, but extends through areas where the faults alone would not be expected to produce passages of this kind. Some portions of the network appear to be at depths ranging from 50 to several hundred meters below the current surface of the valley floor. The Jasper cluster is deeper and harder to resolve clearly with current technology, but the seismic data from that area suggests passages that may be larger, possibly connecting to the known cave systems that already exist in the Jasper region. There are documented caves in the Rockies, some of them extensive, some of them well explored. The Castle Guard cave system, for example, which extends beneath the Columbia Icefield, is already the longest known cave in Canada, running for more than 20 kilometers through the rock. What the recent scans suggest is that Castle Guard, impressive as it already is, may be a branch of something larger, something that extends further, runs deeper, and connects to passages that have not yet been entered by any documented explorer. The southern cluster, near the Montana border, is the one that has attracted the most attention from researchers interested in the human dimension of this story, because it lies in territory that was deeply significant to the Blackfoot Confederacy, to the Ktunaxa, and to other peoples who lived in and around the Rockies for thousands of years before European contact. Their traditions speak of places inside the mountains, not metaphorically, not as symbolic language for the spirit world, though that meaning is present too, but as literal descriptions of physical locations, passages that led to underground chambers, places where the air was warm even in the deepest winter, places where certain ceremonies were performed, places that were understood to connect different parts of the landscape in ways that the surface routes did not. This is the point where the story becomes genuinely difficult to hold in any single framework, because if you approach it purely as geology, you find anomalies that demand explanation. If you approach it purely as history, you find traditions that describe things which now appear to have a physical basis. And if you approach it through the lens of what is actually known about human occupation of the Canadian Rockies over deep time, you find that the standard story, the one that places humans in this landscape at most 12,000 years ago, following the retreat of the last great glaciers, is itself under significant pressure from multiple directions. The ice is where this gets complicated in ways that are hard to overstate. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20 to 25,000 years ago, the Canadian Rockies were buried under ice sheets of extraordinary thickness. The Cordilleran ice sheet, which covered the mountain ranges of western Canada and reached south into what is now the Pacific Northwest of the United States, was not a thin cap of snow and glacial ice. In the Rocky Mountain region, it was thousands of meters thick in places. Mountains that now rise 2,500 to 3,000 meters above sea level were themselves buried under ice that extended far above their summits. Everything on the surface was erased, ground up, scraped clean, deposited as glacial till hundreds of kilometers away. This is why the conventional story of human occupation says that people did not live in the Rockies before the ice retreated, because there was nothing to live in. There was nothing on the surface at all. But here is the question that the recent scans make unavoidably urgent. What was happening inside the mountains during those 25,000 years of ice? The passages that the radar and seismic data are now imaging were not carved by the glacier. They predate it. The limestone dissolution that creates cave systems operates over timescales of millions of years, not tens of thousands. And the ice, while it erased the surface completely, did not penetrate the deep interior of the mountains, did not fill the passages that ran hundreds of meters below the thrust plains, did not reach the chambers that the scans now suggest exist at depth. So there is a layer of the Rockies that the Ice Age never touched, a layer that remained relatively stable in temperature, that had air circulation driven by the same barometric pressure differentials that drive air movement in all large cave systems, that had water from deep sources flowing through it, even when the surface was locked under a kilometer of glacial ice. And if humans were in the Rockies before the ice sheet advanced, or if they sheltered within those underground passages as the ice built up around and above them, the surface record of their presence would have been completely erased. There would be nothing on the surface to find. Any evidence of their occupation before or during the glacial maximum would be inside the rock, in the passages themselves. The possibility that people sheltered underground during the last glacial maximum is not as far-fetched as it might initially sound. There is growing evidence from multiple locations in North America, from sites in Alaska, from coastal refugia that the ice did not reach, from the few pre-Clovis sites that have survived the skepticism of mainstream archaeology, that human occupation of this continent is both older and more geographically distributed than the textbooks acknowledge. The Clovis first model, which held that humans first entered North America roughly 13,000 years ago through a land corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, has been quietly collapsing for 2 decades under the weight of evidence that does not fit it. Sites in Chile, dated to 14,000 years ago, sites in Oregon, dated to 15,000 years. The Monte Verde site, in southern Chile, dated to 14,500 years, with evidence of occupation that suggests an established population rather than a recent arrival. If people were in South America 14,500 years ago, they were in North America significantly earlier, which raises the question of where they went when the ice came. Some clearly went south, and their descendants are the evidence in Chile and Brazil and Peru. Some went to coastal refugia where the ice did not reach, and some, perhaps, went inside the mountains. The traditions of the peoples of the northern Great Plains and the Rocky Mountain foothills speak of ancestors who came from a time before the world as it currently exists, a time when the landscape was profoundly different, when the relationship between humans and the earth was closer, more interior, more embedded in the physical substance of the land. The Blackfoot creation traditions, in some of their forms, describe a time when the people lived within the earth as well as upon it. The Ktunaxa, whose traditional territory includes the southern Rockies on both sides of the present international border, have traditions that describe their ancestors as having always been in this landscape, not as migrants who arrived from elsewhere, but as people whose origins are rooted in the mountains themselves. Academic researchers have generally treated such traditions as symbolic, as mythological explanations of identity and belonging, rather than literal historical accounts. But the seismic scans are making that comfortable dismissal harder to maintain, because the Ktunaxa traditions, when examined alongside the scan data from the southern Rocky Mountain cluster, describe underground features in ways that correspond with suspicious specificity to what the instruments are now revealing. The direction of major passages, the location of larger chambers, the relationship between the underground network and specific surface features, particular valleys, particular river confluences, particular mountain passes that appear again and again in the oral traditions as significant transitional places. This is not proof of anything. Pattern recognition is something the human mind does instinctively, and it is possible to find correspondences between any sufficiently detailed traditional knowledge and any sufficiently ambiguous scientific data. But it is also possible that the correspondences exist because the traditions are accurate, because they describe things that people actually knew, because the knowledge of what lies beneath the Rockies was not invented or imagined, but observed and remembered across a time span that modern scholarship has not been willing to assign to human habitation of this landscape. What would it mean for human history in North America if it turned out that people had been sheltering in, navigating through, and building their cultures around an extensive underground network in the Canadian Rockies for far longer than the accepted timeline allows? It would mean that the peopling of the Americas is a story whose beginning we have not yet found. It would mean that the oral traditions of the First Nations peoples of Western Canada are not folklore, but history, compressed and encoded in narrative forms that were designed to survive across exactly the kind of timescales that written records cannot bridge. And it would mean that what the scanners found beneath the mountains is not just a geological curiosity, but a window into a chapter of human existence that has been invisible because we were looking for it in the wrong places. The passages are there, the data says so, multiple instruments, multiple researchers, multiple approaches, all converging on the same finding. Now the question is, what the passages are, where they go, what they contain, and how they came to be. None of those questions has a settled answer, but the process of finding the answers has begun, and what has already been found is strange enough to justify following the trail wherever it leads. There is a sound that people who have spent time in large cave systems describe with a consistency that is hard to dismiss as coincidence. It is the sound of the mountain breathing, not the wind, which has a different quality, a surface sound that carries weather in it. This is something that comes from below, a slow, rhythmic pressure change in the air that you feel more in your chest than you hear with your ears. Cavers know it. Researchers who have entered the known portions of Castleguard and the other documented Rocky Mountain cave systems know it. And according to people who have spoken with elders from the Ktunaxa and Stony Nakoda nations, it is described in the oral traditions as the breath of the stone people, the beings that live inside the mountains. The traditions do not frame this as metaphor. They frame it as a physical reality, a characteristic of specific places that can be felt and that indicates the presence of something significant deeper in. The breathing of the cave system is actually well understood by speleologists. It is caused by barometric pressure differences between the surface and the interior of the cave network. When surface pressure drops, as it does before a storm, air flows outward from the cave. When surface pressure rises, air flows in. The magnitude of this breathing effect is directly related to the size and connectivity of the cave system. A small, isolated void produces no detectable breathing. A large interconnected network produces a measurable and sometimes powerful air movement that cavers use as a practical guide to the cave's extent and structure. The fact that air movement, consistent with a large connected network, has been documented at locations in the Rockies where no major cave system was previously known to exist is part of what prompted the initial scanning surveys. A researcher who prefers not to be named publicly became aware through conversations with local First Nations community members of several locations in the Jasper area where this outflow of cave air had been noted for generations and was referenced in the community's knowledge of the land. The researcher, whose background was in karst geomorphology, the study of landscapes formed by the dissolution of soluble rock, conducted preliminary ground-penetrating radar surveys at 3 of these locations and got results that justified the larger study that followed. The airflow measurements at those initial sites suggested cave systems significantly larger than anything documented in the existing geological surveys of that region. The radar data confirmed substantial voids in the shallow subsurface at all 3 locations. And when that data was shared with colleagues who were working with seismic tomography equipment, the decision was made to conduct a more comprehensive survey across a longer section of the range. The results of that comprehensive survey are what has been circulating in academic circles and beginning to make its way into the wider conversation. What the survey found at depth, at the level of the major thrust faults and the passages that follow them through the interior of the mountains, is a network whose extent is not yet fully mapped, but which appears to span, at minimum, several hundred kilometers of the range in a broadly northeast-southwest direction. The passages are not uniform in size. There are constrictions where the geology squeezed the original void. There are expansions where dissolution over millions of years widened a fracture into a substantial chamber. There are places where the network appears to divide, running parallel through different thrust planes before the passages reconnect further along. There are places where the seismic data suggests the network descends significantly in depth following geological structures that go deep into the mountain roots. And there are, in specific locations distributed through the network, anomalies within the anomalies. Places where the interior of a passage or chamber produces a seismic signature that differs not only from solid rock, but from the expected signature of an empty void. Places where something is present inside the passage that has different acoustic properties than air or water. The researchers are careful about how they characterize this finding. They use the language of data rather than the language of interpretation. They note that the anomalous signatures could have several explanations, including sediment accumulation, mineral deposits, ice formations that survived the general deglaciation in the cold interior of the deep caves, and water in forms that behave differently under seismic interrogation than open water would. But they also note that the pattern of these anomalous signatures is not random. They cluster near the locations where the network appears to have chambers of larger dimension. They appear at intervals that, while not perfectly regular, are more evenly distributed through the network than random depositional processes would predict. And in the southern Rocky Mountain cluster, they appear in close spatial correspondence with locations that the Katunaxa traditions identify as places of particular significance, places that the traditions describe as having been used for specific purposes that required enclosure, warmth, and separation from the surface world. The convergence of all of this, the geological data, the airflow evidence, the acoustic signatures, the spatial correspondence with traditional knowledge, the context of a pre-Clovis human presence in the Americas that is increasingly well documented, does not prove that these passages are or ever were occupied by humans, but it assembles a case for serious investigation that is difficult to dismiss. And the investigation is underway, though its pace is slowed by factors that have nothing to do with the science. The primary complication is jurisdictional and cultural. The areas where the scan anomalies are most significant are largely within national parks or on traditional territories over which First Nations communities have asserted rights and jurisdiction. Any physical investigation of the underground features, any attempt to actually enter and document the passages, would require negotiations with multiple levels of government and with the affected First Nations communities. Those negotiations are not straightforward. They involve questions about who has authority over what lies beneath the land, questions about the appropriate relationship between scientific investigation and the knowledge systems that the communities have maintained about these places, and questions about what obligations would be created if the investigation confirmed what some of the community knowledge already suggests. The Ktunaxa Nation Council, in particular, has been engaged in discussions about how to approach the question of the underground network in ways that respect both their own knowledge traditions and the possibilities that scientific investigation might open. Their position is nuanced, and it is their position to articulate, not one that outside researchers should speak for. But the fact of the engagement itself is significant. The communities are not opposing investigation. They are asking for investigation that proceeds in a particular way, that treats their knowledge as a partner to the scientific process, rather than as something to be validated or dismissed by it. This is a reasonable request, and it is one that the researchers involved in the scanning project have expressed willingness to honor. The question of timeline remains open. The logistical and bureaucratic processes involved in organizing an investigation of this scale in a national park context are substantial. The scientific community's appetite for results that challenge established timelines is limited by the same institutional conservatism that always makes paradigm-changing discoveries slow to gain acceptance. And the underground itself is patient. Whatever is down there has been there for a very long time. It will wait. But the scanning data has been seen by enough people and has been discussed in enough contexts that the story is moving, whether or not the formal investigation catches up with it. Reports of the findings have circulated in geological conferences. They have appeared in non-peer-reviewed contexts that are sometimes described dismissively as alternative research, but which in practice often carry significant findings before the formal academic literature is ready to acknowledge them. And they have filtered into the awareness of people in and near the Rockies who have their own connections to the landscape and their own reasons for finding the findings plausible. Among those people are the cavers. The Rocky Mountain Cave exploring community, which is small but serious, has its own relationship with the underground landscape of the range that predates the recent scanning surveys by decades. Experienced cavers know the known systems intimately. They know where the known systems end and where the rock goes tight and exploration stops. They know the points in the known systems where the cave air movement suggests something beyond the explored passage, but where the geometry of the rock, as they can observe, it makes further progress impossible without equipment. They do not have or techniques that are not yet developed. And some of them, when they heard about the scanning data and saw the preliminary maps that the researchers shared in private contexts, recognized the locations of the anomalies as places they had already identified as significant from inside. One caver, with more than 30 years of experience in the Rockies, described a section of the Castle Guard system where the cave breathing is particularly pronounced in certain weather conditions, where the air movement is strong enough to extinguish a lighter in a passage that is otherwise still and calm. This point has been known to the caving community for years. It is the kind of observation that gets recorded in the informal literature of cave exploration, in the notes passed between experienced practitioners without necessarily making it into formal geological surveys. The seismic tomography data from the Comprehensive Scanning Survey places one of the largest anomalous features directly on the other side of that wall, directly connected, if the data is correct, to the known Castle Guard system through a passage that is narrow or blocked at its junction with the known cave, but that opens into something much larger immediately beyond. The implications of this specific finding are significant, even within the narrowest geological interpretation. If the Castle Guard system connects to a larger network, the hydrological and atmospheric modelling for that portion of the Rockies would need to be substantially revised. Water movements, through the deep rock influence, surface water quality and quantity in ways that matter enormously to the communities downstream. The Columbia Icefield, which sits above the Jasper cluster of anomalies, is the hydrological apex of a drainage system that feeds rivers flowing to 3 different oceans. Understanding what happens to water that disappears into the rock of the mountains and how it moves through the deep passages before emerging in springs and seeps downstream is not only scientifically interesting, it is practically important in a world where water systems are under increasing stress. The mountain is keeping its own account. The water that falls on the high peaks in the form of snow, that accumulates in glaciers, that melts and seeps into the fractured limestone, that travels through passages we cannot see to emerge in places we cannot predict, has been doing this for millions of years. The passages it has carved are its autobiography, written in the language of dissolution and time. What the scans are reading, for the first time, is a portion of that autobiography, and what they have found suggests that the text is much longer than anyone expected. The people who knew the mountains from the inside had a different name for the passages than the geological surveys do. They did not call them karst features, or dissolution voids, or thrust plane-controlled conduits. They called them the roads of the old ones. Not in English, of course. In the languages of the peoples who carried this knowledge, the specific terms carry meanings that translation flattens and simplifies. But the concept is consistent across the traditions of multiple nations whose territories touch the Rockies. The passages inside the mountains were roads. They went somewhere. They were travelled. And the people who travelled them were understood to be, in some sense, prior to the peoples who now live on the surface, around and above them. The Stony Nakoda, whose traditional territory covers a large portion of the Alberta Rockies, including the Banff region where one of the primary scan anomaly clusters is located, have maintained traditions about underground travel routes for as long as their oral histories extend. The traditions describe these routes not as supernatural or metaphorical but as practical. They were used in winter, when surface travel through the high passes was impossible. They were used to move between valleys that were otherwise separated by geological barriers. They were used for purposes that were both practical and ceremonial, the distinction between those two categories being much less sharp in traditional knowledge systems than Western academic frameworks tend to assume. The winter travel aspect of the tradition is particularly interesting in light of what the scanning data implies about the thermal environment of the deep passages. Large cave systems maintain a relatively constant temperature year-round, approximately equal to the mean annual surface temperature of the region in which they are located. In the Canadian Rockies, that mean annual temperature is several degrees above freezing, but far warmer than the surface conditions in deep winter, when temperatures at high altitude can drop to 40 below. A cave system at constant temperature is, in winter, dramatically warmer than the surface. The outflow of relatively warm air from cave entrances in winter conditions is a well-documented phenomenon in karst landscapes and would be immediately obvious to any people familiar with the terrain, serving as a reliable marker of cave entrances and as a practical incentive to use underground routes when the alternative was travel across a frozen, wind-scoured surface. The traditions of the Ktunaxa include descriptions of specific passages that connected valleys that are now accessible only through high mountain passes. The Ktunaxa traditional territory spans the Rockies from what is now southeastern British Columbia to northwestern Montana, crossing the continental divide in multiple locations. Their knowledge of the landscape is correspondingly deep, and their traditions include not just the existence of underground passages, but specific information about their characteristics. Which passages have air movement, where water is present, where the passages are low and require crawling, and where they open into walkable height, where the rock is wet and slippery, and where it is dry. This level of detail is either the product of imagination applied to a landscape over a very long time, or it is the product of actual experience. And when that level of detail is compared to the scan data, the correspondence is troubling for anyone who wants to maintain that the oral traditions are purely inventive. The scan data is not yet detailed enough to confirm or deny every specific description in the traditions. The spatial resolution of seismic tomography at depth is limited, typically resolving features of a few meters or more but blurring finer details. But at the level of which passages are large and which are constricted, which areas contain chambers and which are narrow corridors, which sections trend at what angles through the mountain, the correspondence between the traditional knowledge and the instrumental data is consistent enough to constitute more than chance agreement. There is a particular tradition, common in various forms across several of the nations of the Rocky Mountain region, that describes a time when a great cold came over the land and the people went inside the mountains to survive. The surface world froze, the rivers stopped, the animals disappeared or changed their behavior in ways that made hunting impossible by surface methods, and a portion of the people, guided by specific knowledge of where the mountain passages led, moved underground and lived there until conditions changed. When they returned to the surface, the world was different. The ice was gone, the landscape had been reshaped, old landmarks were buried or erased, and new ones had been deposited by the retreating ice. The people who came back from underground were the ancestors of the peoples who now live in and around the Rockies, and their knowledge of the underground world is part of the inheritance those peoples carry. This tradition maps with striking precision onto the geological history of the region. The Great Cold is the last glacial maximum. The surface world freezing and the rivers stopping is what happens when a kilometer of ice sits on top of a mountain range. The disappearance of animals is the literal extinction or displacement of the megafauna that characterized the pre-glacial North American landscape. The reshaped landscape that the returning people found is exactly what the retreat of the Cordilleran ice sheet produced. A terrain scoured clean of old features, filled with new deposits, drained by rivers that ran in new channels through valleys that had been fundamentally reorganized by glacial action. And the underground survival is now supported by the scan data, which shows passages that were certainly present during the glacial period, that would have been habitable in the sense of being above freezing and supplied with air, and that appear to be connected to one another in ways that would allow movement between underground locations over significant distances. The question that follows from this is the question that the mainstream archaeological community finds most difficult to engage with. If people sheltered underground during the last glacial maximum, and if the evidence of that shelter is now buried inside mountains rather than preserved in surface sites, then the entire framework by which we date and describe the peopling of the Americas needs revision, not minor adjustment, not a few thousand years added to existing timelines, fundamental revision, because the people who came back from underground after the ice retreated would have brought with them a continuous cultural tradition stretching back to before the glacial period. Their technology, their language, their knowledge of the landscape, their spiritual and ceremonial practices would all have roots in a period that current archaeology cannot access because the evidence is either underground or was erased by the ice itself. The implications for understanding the diversity of indigenous cultures in North America are significant. The remarkable variety of languages, technologies, cosmologies, and social structures among the First Nations and Native American peoples of the continent has generally been explained through the lens of a single founding migration from Asia, perhaps followed by additional waves with subsequent divergence over time. But if some of those groups had been isolated in underground refugia during the glacial maximum, developing their cultures in separation from other groups that had survived elsewhere, the divergence would have deeper roots. The underground communities would have had their own developmental trajectory, possibly including practices and technologies that were independently invented in the underground context and that left no surface archaeological trace. This is speculative, but it is not arbitrary speculation. It follows logically from the physical evidence of the passages and from the cultural evidence of the traditions, and it is testable in principle, if not yet in practice. If the passages can be physically investigated, if the interiors of the chambers can be examined, then the question of whether they contain evidence of human occupation becomes empirical rather than theoretical. Sediment layers in cave systems preserve extraordinarily well under the right conditions. The cold, stable environment of a deep cave can maintain organic material, hearth remains, lithic debris, bone fragments, for timeframes that exceed the limits of surface preservation by orders of magnitude. The cave bare bones that have been found in the known portions of Castleguard have been dated to periods well beyond the earliest accepted human occupation of the region. Human material in the same environment could potentially be dated with equal precision. The researchers who conducted the scanning surveys are aware of this possibility and have included it in the framing of why the investigation matters. The language they use in the documents that have been circulating is circumspect but clear. They note that the anomalous signatures within the larger network features could include material of organic origin, and that the investigation of those signatures is warranted by the importance of resolving questions about the timing and nature of human presence in the Rocky Mountain region. This is scientific language, for we think there might be something there that was left by people, and we want to go look. The something in question is not nothing. The anomalous signatures within the network that are not simply empty void or water or ice have been examined through several analytical lenses to try to narrow down what they might be. The acoustic properties of the signatures, the way the seismic waves interact with the material in those specific locations, are consistent with several possibilities. One is compacted organic sediment, the kind of material that accumulates over long periods in a cave environment, and that can preserve a detailed record of everything that was deposited in the cave over time. Another is wood, or some material with the acoustic properties of compressed organic plant material. A third is modified stone, material that has been worked or arranged in ways that change its acoustic properties relative to natural rock. None of these interpretations is certain. The data is what it is, a set of acoustic measurements at a distance, filtered through the complex geology of the surrounding rock. But the range of interpretations that are consistent with the data all fall within the space of things that would be expected in a location that had been used by people over a long period of time. And they are not consistent with the interpretations that would be expected from purely geological processes operating in an uninhabited cave. The people of the Rockies knew something was down there. The people with the instruments now know something is down there. The question of when those two forms of knowledge will be able to meet in the actual physical space beneath the mountains remains open, but the meeting seems increasingly inevitable. The underground is patient, but it is no longer invisible. Among the geological features of the Canadian Rockies that are already documented and accessible to researchers, There is one that has long been noted as anomalous in ways that the new scan data now allows to be understood differently. The Miette hot springs, located near Jasper, are the hottest natural hot springs in the Canadian Rockies, with water emerging at temperatures that require a heat source significantly deeper than the surface geology would explain. Hot spring systems in mountain environments are generally fed by water that descends to depth, is heated by geothermal sources, and then rises back to the surface along fault systems or permeable pathways through the rock. The temperature of the emerging water is related to the depth of the circulation, with higher temperatures indicating deeper circulation paths. The Miette water emerges at approximately 54 degrees Celsius. This is hot enough to require circulation to depths substantially greater than what the local surface geology would suggest, and the chemical signature of the water indicates that it has traveled through rock types that do not appear at the surface in the immediate vicinity of the springs. The water has been somewhere that is not obvious from the surface. It has been in contact with rock formations that are buried or that exist only at significant depth in this part of the range. And the seismic data from the Jasper cluster of anomalies places a significant portion of the underground network directly in the path that the hydrological modelling would indicate for water circulating to the depths required to produce the Miette temperature profile. This is again not proof, but it is a convergence. The hot spring that geologists have always known was puzzling is puzzling in a direction that points toward the same underground network that the scans are now imaging. The water is following paths through the mountain that nobody has seen directly, but that the instruments are beginning to describe. And the paths it takes through the deep rock are the same paths that, the scan data suggests, form a connected network extending from the Jasper area southward through the range. The relationship between hot spring systems and cave networks in karst landscapes is well understood in general terms. Hot water, ascending through limestone, dissolves the rock much more efficiently than cold water does. Hot springs in limestone terrain create caves from below, eating upward through the rock as the heated, mineralized water rises and cools and deposits its dissolved load on the walls and floors of the passages it creates. These hypergenic caves, as the geological literature calls them, can be very large and very labyrinthine, because the dissolution process works in all directions through the soluble rock rather than simply following gravity downward the way surface water does. The caves created by rising hot water are among the largest known in the world. Lechuguilla Cave in New Mexico, whose discovery in 1986 revealed a system of extraordinary scale and complexity, is a hypergenic cave formed not by surface water descending, but by hydrogen sulfide-rich groundwater ascending from below. The possibility that a significant portion of the Rocky Mountain underground network is hypergenic rather than simply the product of surface water dissolution changes the way the network needs to be thought about. It means the passages could be older than the landscape itself in some sense, formed before the mountains reached their current elevation, shaped by the deep circulation of groundwater through rock that was subsequently uplifted by the same tectonic forces that built the range. It means the network's relationship to the surface topography may be counterintuitive in ways that have made it harder to image and interpret from above. And it means the environments within the deeper portions of the network may be thermally and chemically quite different from what is observed in the shallower, cold water portions that connect to the surface. For humans who might have used these passages, the thermal environment of the deeper portions would have been significant. A hypergenic cave section at the depth where the Miette circulation occurs would be warm by mountain standards. Not hot, but warm enough to be dramatically more comfortable than the surface environment in winter. Warm enough to maintain liquid water. Warm enough to support biological activity, including the microbial communities that form the base of the cave food web, and that in turn support the invertebrate and vertebrate life that can persist in deep cave environments without direct access to surface sunlight. The cave food web is not a robust one by surface standards, but it is real. Cave fish, cave salamanders, cave invertebrates of various kinds all exist in documented cave systems around the world, sustained by chemosynthetic microbial communities that derive energy from chemical reactions rather than from sunlight. In a warm, chemically active cave environment, like what the Miette circulation suggests for parts of the Rockies network, The biological richness of the underground world could be substantially greater than in a cold, inactive cave. There could be food there, not abundant food by any surface measure, but food. And that makes a difference when the surface world is locked under a kilometer of ice. The traditions of the Rocky Mountain peoples include descriptions of underground creatures that are not easily identified with surface fauna. Not supernatural beings, though the traditions embed the descriptions in a cosmological framework that makes them also spiritually significant. But creatures that live in the dark, that do not need sunlight, that are found in specific places underground, and that were understood as part of the interior world rather than the surface world. Cave-adapted fauna. The peoples knew they were there because they had been in the caves with them. The traditions preserve that knowledge in narrative form because that is how knowledge that cannot be physically demonstrated is maintained across generations. The intersection of the geological evidence, the biological possibilities, the thermal data from the hot spring systems, and the traditional knowledge forms a portrait of an underground world that was, under the right historical conditions, not just passable but livable, not comfortable by any modern standard, not abundant or safe in the way that surface environments can be, but survivable. And survival is what mattered when the ice came down. The ice came down slowly, by human standards, not as a single catastrophic event, but as a gradual, relentless advance over centuries and millennia. There would have been generations during which the ice was a presence on the horizon, a growing cold that pushed certain animals south or to lower elevations, that shortened the growing season, that made the high passes increasingly dangerous in winter, and eventually impassable year-round. The people who lived in the mountains during that long advance would have had time to observe the changes, to adapt, to expand their knowledge of and relationship with the underground passages that the changing surface was making increasingly relevant. The knowledge of the underground was not discovered in a moment of emergency. It was accumulated over a long period, through observation and exploration and the testing of limits, through the kind of systematic learning that hunter-gatherer cultures apply to every aspect of their environment. The people who eventually moved underground as the surface became uninhabitable were not novices entering an unknown world. They were experienced navigators of a landscape they had spent generations learning. The underground was part of their territory. It had always been part of their territory. The ice changed the proportion of their lives lived underground versus on the surface, but it did not change the fundamental relationship. This is what the traditions are preserving, not just the memory that people once survived underground, but the knowledge that the relationship between the human community and the underground world of the mountains is ancient, specific, and continuous. The passages were not a refuge that was used once in a crisis and then forgotten. They were a resource that was used repeatedly, that was maintained in the cultural knowledge as significant and navigable, and that continued to be used for practical and ceremonial purposes long after the ice retreated and the surface world became habitable again. The ceremonial uses of the underground, the practices that continued after the surface survival emergency had passed, are where the traditional knowledge and the institutional nervousness of academic research most sharply diverge. The academic literature is comfortable discussing the physical properties of cave systems, the biology of cave-adapted fauna, even the theoretical possibility of human occupation during glacial refugia scenarios. It is significantly less comfortable discussing what the underground meant to the people who used it, what they did there, what knowledge they developed about the nature of reality through their extended experience of an environment where the ordinary distinctions between day and night, between surface and sky, between the living and the dead, operate differently than on the surface. The traditions describe underground practices that fall under the category that anthropologists call altered states of consciousness, shamanic experience, initiatory rites. These are cross-cultural phenomena that appear in virtually every human society that has a sustained relationship with cave environments. The Chauvet cave paintings in France, some of the oldest known human art, were made deep underground in a dark, acoustically unusual environment that researchers now believe was specifically selected for its capacity to produce certain neurological states in people spending extended time in it. The relationship between cave environments and human spiritual and psychological experience is not incidental. It is documented across cultures and across time. The Rocky Mountain traditions describe underground places where the boundary between the human world and the world of the spirit beings was thin. Places where knowledge was received that could not be accessed on the surface. Places where the identity of the person who entered was transformed by the experience of the underground, so that they emerged different from how they had gone in. These descriptions are common to shamanic traditions worldwide. They are also, when read without the assumption that they are purely symbolic, descriptions of the psychological effects of extended time in a large, dark, acoustically complex, thermally consistent underground environment on a human nervous system that evolved on the surface. The underground does things to human perception. The absence of light removes the primary orienting sense and forces the nervous system to rely on hearing, touch, and proprioception in ways that are unusual and disorienting in the short term, and that produce lasting perceptual changes with longer exposure. The acoustic properties of large cave chambers, where sound reflects and decays differently than in any surface environment, create auditory experiences that have no surface equivalent and that the human mind interprets through its existing frameworks, producing experiences that are described in the language of encounter with non-ordinary beings. The thermal consistency and physical isolation of the deep cave create a sensory environment that is, in a specific neurological sense, the opposite of the ordinary surface world, and the brain's response to that opposition is documented and real. None of this is mystical. All of it is empirical. The people who used the Rocky Mountain passages for ceremonial purposes were not indulging in fantasy. They were using a specific physical environment to produce specific neurological states that they understood to have practical value for the community. The knowledge that came back from underground with the people who had spent time there in those states was evaluated on practical terms, by whether it was useful, by whether it served the community's needs, by whether it corresponded to things that could be verified in the physical world. The traditions that have survived are the ones that pass that test. The scan data does not speak to any of this directly. The instruments measure acoustic properties of rock and void. They do not measure meaning. But the fact that the physical structure the instruments are revealing corresponds with the physical descriptions in the traditions, that the passages and chambers the scans are imaging are in the places the traditions say significant underground locations should be, supports the hypothesis that the traditions are preserving accurate information about the physical reality of the underground world. And if they are accurate about the physical reality, there is reason to take seriously their descriptions of what happens inside that physical reality when human beings spend time in it. What the traditions do not describe, and what the scans cannot yet reveal, is the full extent of the network. The comprehensive survey covered a significant portion of the range, but not all of it. The southern cluster, the Jasper cluster, and the Bow Valley cluster are reasonably well characterized by the existing data, but there are sections between and beyond these clusters where the survey data is sparse or absent, where the geology is complex enough to make interpretation difficult, where the terrain made instrument placement difficult. The full map of the network remains incomplete, and the portions that are missing may be significant. There are traditions from communities whose territories lie to the north and west of the main survey area that describe underground connections between the Rocky Mountain system and cave networks further into the interior of British Columbia. The Tsilhqot'in, whose territory lies in the plateau country west of the Rockies, have traditions about underground travel that predate contact with European settlers and that describe connections between the interior plateau country and the mountain interior. If those connections are real in the physical sense, if there are passages linking the Rockies network to the karst landscapes of the interior plateau, then the system is not just large, it is continental in scale. This is the outer limit of what the current data can support. The seismic survey did not extend west of the main Rocky Mountain divide, and the karst geology of the interior plateau, while known to be extensive, has not been systematically scanned at the depths that would reveal connections to the deeper mountain system. But the geological conditions that would be necessary for such connections to exist are not impossible. The limestone formations of the Rockies do not simply stop at the continental divide. They extend into the mountain ranges to the west, becoming deeper and more fragmented as the tectonic environment changes, but maintaining a continuity that, over the timescales of geological dissolution, could support passage formation across the full width of the mountain ranges. The traditions say the roads went a long way. The geology does not rule it out. The instruments have not yet looked. There is a lake in the Canadian Rockies that sits in a glacially carved basin at an elevation of nearly 2,000 meters. Its water is a color that seems impossible, a turquoise so saturated that it looks artificial, the product of rock flour, fine particles of glacially ground stone suspended in the water that reflect the blue-green spectrum of sunlight in a way that makes the lake seem to glow from within. Most people who see it for the first time think it looks like it was painted, like something generated by a machine that was trying to produce the most visually perfect mountain lake and overshot the mark. Below that lake, according to the seismic data from the Bow Valley cluster, there is a chamber, not directly below the lake bed, but close, offset to the southwest and at a depth of approximately 90 meters below the valley floor. The chamber is large, by the standards of what the survey resolved, possibly 30 meters in diameter and of uncertain height. It sits at the junction of two major thrust planes, in a location where the dissolution of limestone would be expected to be particularly efficient because the intersecting fracture systems allow water to move through the rock from multiple directions. The chamber connects to the broader network in at least two directions, one trending northeast toward lower elevations and one trending southwest and upward toward the main mountain mass. The lake above knows nothing about the chamber below. The tourists who photograph the lake and post the images to social media know nothing about the chamber below. The chamber is indifferent to all of them. It has been sitting in the dark at 90 meters depth for longer than any human civilization has existed, and it will be sitting there long after the current fascination with its existence has run its course. But the fact of its existence changes what the mountain means. It changes what the lake sits on. It changes the relationship between the visible surface of the landscape and the invisible interior. The Stony Nakoda name for the lake in question, the name that predates the European names by an unknown but certainly very long period, translates in approximate English as the lake above the breathing stone. The breathing stone is the rock that exhales mountain air. The stone that breathes is a cave. The lake above the cave that breathes is the lake that the scan data now shows sits above the chamber at 90 meters depth. The name was always a description. It was never just a name. The archaeology of the Canadian Rockies above ground has always been thin. Not because people were not there, but because the conditions of the mountain environment are hard on organic material, because the glacial erosion that reshaped the landscape repeatedly over the past 2 million years has destroyed much of what earlier occupants left behind, and because the systematic archaeological investigation of the region did not begin until the 20th century, by which time the most accessible sites had already been altered or destroyed by the construction of railways and roads and tourist infrastructure. What exists in the formal record is a fraction of what was there, which is itself a fraction of what was made. The oldest accepted evidence of human presence in the Rockies places people in the region approximately 10 to 11,000 years ago, shortly after the most recent glacial retreat opened the landscape for recolonization from the south and east. These earliest documented inhabitants are known primarily from their stone tool assemblages, which fall into the Clovis and related traditions that are characteristic of the first documented phase of human occupation across western North America. They hunted the last of the megafauna, the mammoths and mastodons and giant bison whose bones appear in the geological record alongside the tools that killed them. Within a few thousand years, those animals were gone, and the cultures that depended on them transformed into the more diverse and regionally specific traditions that characterize the later prehistory of the region. But this record has gaps, big ones. The period between 11,000 years ago and the somewhat better documented archaeological record of 5 to 8,000 years ago is poorly understood in the Rockies specifically. There are sites but few of them, and they tend to be at lower elevations, where preservation is better. The high mountain areas, which are exactly where the underground network is concentrated, according to the scan data, are almost archaeologically empty in the formal record. They are also exactly the areas where the ice was last to retreat, and where the post-glacial surface would be most recently modified and therefore most destructive of earlier material. The formal record's silence about the high mountain areas in the early post-glacial period is not evidence that nobody was there. It is evidence that the record-keeping environment is particularly bad there, and it creates a serious methodological problem for any attempt to test the hypothesis of earlier or more extensive occupation of the mountain interior. The evidence that would confirm the hypothesis, if it exists, is not on the surface. it is underground. There is one class of surface find from the Rockies that does not fit neatly into the standard archaeological framework, and that has been discussed in the literature with varying degrees of comfort. These are the finds of worked stone, tools and flakes and cores, at elevations and in locations that the standard human occupation timeline would not predict. High mountain sites, well above the tree line, in locations that would be accessible only in summer and only with substantial travel from the lower valleys where the established camps were. Not unusual in themselves, since hunter-gatherers range widely, but unusual in their density, their distribution, and in some cases their age, which in the few instances where dating has been possible, pushes against or slightly beyond the accepted earliest occupation dates for the region. More puzzling are the occasional finds of tool types that do not match the established cultural sequence, lithic forms that resemble but do not precisely match the Clovis tradition, forms that are simpler in some respects, more sophisticated in others, forms that suggest either an independent local development or the presence of a technological tradition that does not have its closest relatives in the Beringian migration route from which the Clovis people are assumed to have descended. These finds are small in number, and their interpretation is contested. They sit at the edge of what the formal literature is willing to say, noted but not integrated into the main narrative, because integrating them would require a revision of the main narrative that the discipline is not yet ready to undertake. The revision that would be required is substantial. If there were people in the Rockies before the Clovis horizon, they were there before the generally accepted timing of the initial peopling of the Americas in this region. They would represent either a separate migration event, an earlier wave that is not currently accounted for in the genetic or archaeological models, or they would represent a survival of a population that entered the Americas substantially earlier than the Clovis people, and that maintained a presence in the Rockies region through the glacial maximum, including potentially through the underground refugia that the scan data now suggests existed. Either option is significant, either option requires a rethinking of the standard model, and either option would explain something about the indigenous peoples of the Rockies that has always been observed without being satisfactorily explained. The Ktunaxa language is a language isolate, not just distinctive within its region, not just unusual within its language family, a complete isolate, with no known relatives anywhere in the world. No language that is or has been spoken by any other known human population shares the fundamental structures of Ktunaxa. It does not belong to any of the language families that are used to group and relate the other hundreds of indigenous languages of North America. It is alone. Language isolates are very old languages. They represent the survivors of divergence events that happened so long ago that the sister languages have all gone extinct or diverged beyond recognition, leaving only one line of descent still spoken. Ktunaxa has been here as a distinct linguistic lineage for a very long time, long enough to diverge completely from everything else. Lushit, long enough for whatever population originally spoke its ancestor language to have been isolated from other populations for a period measured not in centuries but in millennia. The underground scenario fits. An isolated population in an underground refugium, separated from other groups for the duration of the glacial maximum and for some additional period before and after, would accumulate linguistic divergence at exactly the rate that would produce a complete isolate. The Ktunaxa language in this reading is a linguistic fossil, preserving in its structure the evidence of the long isolation that produced a people whose knowledge of the underground landscape is encoded in their traditions with a specificity that now, in the age of seismic tomography, can be compared to instrumental data. The comparison is not comfortable for a discipline that has long maintained that the peopling of the Americas was a relatively simple process of migration from a single source population at a relatively recent time. But discomfort is not a scientific argument. The data is what it is. The traditions are what they are, the language is what it is, and the mountain is what it is, which includes, now demonstrably, a network of passages and chambers that have been there since before any human walked on the surface above them, and that may have been inside those passages when the surface world was not walkable at all. The question of what other languages of the Western Americas might share this isolated character might represent the linguistic traces of similarly isolated populations that survived the glacial maximum in different refugia is one that historical linguists have not systematically addressed in the context of underground survival. The work that has been done on language isolates and quasi-isolates in North America generally focuses on surface migration routes, on geographic isolation by mountain ranges or deserts or ocean, on the relatively shallow timeframes that the standard settlement model allows. Expanding the frame to include underground isolation over the timescales implied by the glacial history of the continent would require rethinking the linguistics from the foundations, and that kind of foundational rethinking is resisted not because it is impossible, but because it is difficult, and because the professional incentive structure of academic disciplines rewards incremental work within established frameworks, rather than the kind of sweeping revision that evidence sometimes demands. It is worth noting, in this context, that the rethinking has happened before. The Clovis first model was itself a paradigm that resisted challenge for decades before the accumulation of contrary evidence became undeniable. The same institutional dynamics that protected Clovis first from legitimate challenge for longer than the evidence justified are operating now to protect the current consensus about the timing and roots of the peopling of the primer Americas. The evidence is accumulating. The paradigm will shift. The question is whether it will shift in time to accommodate the underground network story, or whether the story will have to wait for a generation of scholars who did not build their careers on the model being challenged. Meanwhile, the mountains are being investigated by people who do not have careers to protect in the same way. The independent researchers, the community-based knowledge holders, the cavers, the hydrologists following the water, the atmospheric scientists tracking the cave air, are all accumulating observations that do not fit the standard model and that do not require the standard model's endorsement to be real. The mountain does not care what the academic consensus says. It has its passages regardless. And the people who have always known about those passages are talking to the people with instruments, and the instruments are confirming what the people already knew. One of the researchers involved in the scanning survey has spoken in informal contexts about a moment early in the data analysis process when he first overlaid the scan results with a map of traditional place names provided by a Ktunaxa community liaison. The overlay was not precise. Traditional place names reference specific features and landmarks that are defined by human-scale perception of the landscape, not by GPS coordinates. But when the researcher adjusted for the systematic differences between how the traditional knowledge was encoded and how the scan data was mapped, the correspondence between the named underground places in the tradition and the anomalous features in the scan data was, in his description, startling. Not ambiguous. Not a matter of interpretation. Startling. Specific named places match specific scan anomalies in location, in relative orientation to surface features, and in the character descriptions that the tradition provided. This chamber is round and warm. That passage goes down before it comes up. There is water at this location, not flowing, standing. The instruments said the same things. That researcher has been careful about how he discusses this publicly. He is aware of the professional risk of being seen to endorse indigenous traditional knowledge as a guide to geological research. The academic culture of natural science has a complex and often uncomfortable relationship with non-Western knowledge systems, one that is slowly improving, but that still carries embedded assumptions about what counts as reliable knowledge and who gets to produce it. But the conversation is happening. The willingness of the communities to share their knowledge with the scientific process, in contexts where the process is structured, to treat that knowledge with respect, rather than as a source to be mined and discarded, is enabling a kind of collaboration that neither party could achieve alone. The communities know where the passages are and what they contain. The scientists have instruments that can image the passages at depths and in ways that the communities cannot access directly. Together, they can build a picture of the underground world that is more complete and more accurate than either could produce independently. The political and institutional processes required to convert that collaboration into formal scientific publications and official archaeological surveys are slow. But the knowledge is not waiting for the institutions. It is accumulating in conversations, in field notes, in the memories of researchers who have seen things they are not quite ready to publish, but that are shaping the questions they are asking. The story of the Rocky Mountain Underground Network is, in this sense, further along than it appears from the surface. The formal publication record shows almost nothing, but the actual state of knowledge, among the small group of people who are positioned to know it, is considerably more advanced. The gap between what is known and what is formally documented is large, and it is growing, because knowledge is accumulating faster than institutions can process and validate it. That gap is uncomfortable for a scientific culture that places enormous value on peer review and formal validation. But it is also historically normal. Most significant scientific discoveries have a period of informal circulation and discussion before they achieve formal recognition. The gap closes eventually. The question is when. The geological survey that preceded the scanning project, conducted in the 1990s as part of a broader mapping effort for the national park system, made a note that was not followed up on at the time and that has only recently been retrieved from the archived records and recognized as significant. The note, in the margin of a field log from a survey conducted in the Bow Valley area, reads as follows. Significant air movement from fault exposure at south face. Cannot account for volume with known void. Possible deep connection not apparent from surface. The surveyor moved on to the next location, and the note sat in the archive for more than 20 years before a researcher working on the scanning project found it while reviewing historical records. The fault exposure referenced in the note is directly above one of the primary anomaly clusters in the Bow Valley scan data. 20 years. The note was there for 20 years. The passage was there for however long before that. The tradition that described what lay behind the fault exposure was there for longer still, maintained in the knowledge of the Stony Nakoda people across generations whose count is not precisely known, but certainly exceeds any written record. And a surveyor from the 1990s made a note in a margin that preserved just enough information for a researcher in the present day to connect it to new data and to pull another thread in the story of what lies beneath the mountains. The threads are numerous and they are pulling the scan data, the archived notes, the traditional knowledge, the linguistic isolation of the Ktunaxa, the thermal signature of the Mieta hot springs, the anomalous air movements documented by cavers, the surface finds that do not fit the standard chronology, the stories of underground travel and underground survival that have been maintained across a span of time that archaeology cannot currently measure. Each thread leads to the same place, not metaphorically, literally. They lead to a specific location inside a mountain range in Western Canada where something is present that the standard story of this landscape did not account for and does not yet fully explain. The official position of the relevant geological and archaeological institutions is that the scanning data is interesting and warrants further investigation, but that no conclusions should be drawn until physical investigation of the fine underground features can be conducted. This is a reasonable position from an institutional risk management perspective. It is less reasonable as a description of what the data actually implies, which is not ambiguous about the existence of an extensive underground network, but is open about what the network contains and how it was formed. The existence of the network is not a conclusion that awaits physical investigation. It is what the instruments measured. The physical investigation will determine what the network contains and what that means for the human history of the region. The physical investigation will happen. The logistical and political processes required to authorize it are progressing, slowly, through multiple levels of government and community consultation. The timeline is uncertain, but the direction is clear. At some point, equipment will be carried into the mountains, and researchers will descend into passages that no documented explorer has entered, and they will see what is there. Whatever they find will be significant, because the network itself is significant, regardless of its contents, and because the story that has built up around the network, the geological story, and the cultural story, and the historical story, is the kind of story that does not resolve without physical encounter. When the encounter happens, it will not be the end of the story. It will be another beginning. Every cave exploration is a beginning rather than an end, because what is found inside always opens more questions than it closes. The interior of a mountain is not a museum with labeled exhibits. It is a complex environment whose history is encoded in layers that require painstaking and specialized analysis to read. The sediments on a cave floor can contain thousands of years of accumulated history, but that history requires years of laboratory work to extract and interpret. The water chemistry can carry information about sources and flow paths that require sophisticated geochemical analysis to decode. and if there is any evidence of human presence, the careful documentation and analysis of that evidence within a framework that respects the knowledge and concerns of the communities whose ancestors may have left it will require a kind of interdisciplinary collaboration that takes time to organize and execute. The mountains will not give up their contents in a season. They did not accumulate them in a season. The relationship between the underground world and the human communities who have known about it is old and complex and will not simplify under the pressure of scientific investigation. But the investigation will proceed, and the findings will accumulate, and the story will become more detailed and more specific and more rooted in physical evidence. While the traditional knowledge that has always described the underground world will find in those findings either confirmation of what has always been known or new information that extends and deepens that knowledge in directions that the power, traditions alone could not reach. This is the best possible outcome of the convergence of scientific investigation and traditional knowledge, not the replacement of one by the other, not the validation of the traditions by science, as if the traditions needed external validation to be authoritative, but a genuine exchange in which both forms of knowledge are extended by their encounter with each other, and in which the underground world of the Canadian Rockies becomes better understood than either tradition or instrument could have made it alone. The mountain that breathes, the lake above the breathing stone. The roads of the old ones, running through the dark interior of a range that was old before any human footprint touched its surface, and that has watched the entire human story in this part of the world from a position of deep geological indifference. The mountain does not know or care what we make of what lies within it, but we make something of it anyway, because that is what humans do. We find patterns, we build stories, we follow the threads that the data and the traditions give us until they lead somewhere. The threads lead down, into the stone, into the dark, into a part of the world that has always been there, that has always been significant, and that is only now beginning to be seen by the full range of human attention, scientific and cultural and historical, and simply curious, that it has always deserved. Let us follow those threads a little further. There is a river that the Ktunaxa call by a name that translates, approximately, as the river that comes from inside. It is not a large river by Rocky Mountain standards. It is a cold, clear, moderately fast-moving stream that emerges from the base of a limestone cliff in the southern Rockies and runs down through a forested canyon before joining a larger drainage system. Most of the people who encounter it know it by its European name, given in the early 19th century by a fur trader who noted its unusual clarity and coldness compared to the other streams in the area. He attributed these qualities to the speed of the snowmelt that fed it and moved on. The Ktunaxa knew better. The river comes from inside because it does. It is a resurgent stream, a river whose water entered the ground at some point higher in the drainage and travelled underground through the limestone before emerging at the spring that forms the river's source. Resurgent streams are common in karst landscapes. They are one of the primary indicators that a cave system is present. Water that goes in somewhere must come out somewhere, and where it comes out is where you find the resurgence. The clarity and coldness of the river that the fur trader observed are characteristic of resurgence water, which has been filtered through limestone and is maintained at cave temperature, colder than surface meltwater in summer and warmer than surface water in winter. The seismic data from the southern Rocky Mountain cluster places a significant branch of the underground network in the drainage basin that feeds the spring at the base of the limestone cliff. The network in this area shows passages that appear to extend well up into the mountain mass, far beyond the simple drainage area that would be expected to produce a spring of this size. The water volume of the resurgence, measured in a hydrological survey conducted several years ago as part of a water resource assessment for a downstream community, is substantially larger than the surface drainage into the limestone formation above the spring can account for. The water is coming from somewhere that the surface topography does not explain. The scan data provides a candid explanation that the surface topography alone could not offer. The additional water is coming through the network. It is being contributed by a drainage area that extends beyond the apparent boundaries of the surface catchment because the underground passages connect the spring's resurgence point to a much larger area of the mountain range than the surface topography would indicate. Water that falls on peaks and ridges that drain toward the other side of the mountain, toward watersheds that flow in an entirely different direction, is finding its way into the underground network and emerging at this spring. The mountain is doing something with water that the surface topography says it should not be doing. This kind of hydrological anomaly is known in karst landscapes. It is called a transdivide karst connection, and it occurs when cave passages connect drainage basins on opposite sides of a topographic divide. It is evidence of a cave system old enough and extensive enough to have evolved passages that do not follow the surface topography because they were formed before the surface topography reached its current configuration. In the Canadian Rockies, where the mountains are still relatively young by geological standards, and where the internal thrust fault structures that guide cave formation are not aligned with the surface drainage divides, the conditions for transdivide connections are favorable. The fact that the scan data suggests the Rocky Mountain network includes such connections makes geological sense. The fact that the Katunaxa name for the river has always acknowledged that its water comes from inside the mountain suggests that the people who named it knew what was happening underneath. The water tells the story of the underground in the language of flow rates and temperature profiles and chemical signatures. Hydrogeologists who study the springs and seeps of the Rocky Mountain region have been accumulating this language for decades, assembling a picture of the underground water system that predates the scanning surveys and that in many ways anticipated their findings. The unusual behavior of certain springs, their volume, their temperature, their consistency through seasonal cycles, their chemical properties, has long been recognized as evidence of extensive underground pathways. What the scanning surveys have added is an image of those pathways, a visual representation that makes it possible to see, even from a distance and through the filter of seismic data interpretation, what the water has been telling in its chemical language for as long as anyone has been listening. The convergence of the hydrological story and the scan story is the most scientifically solid part of the case for the Rocky Mountain underground network. It does not require any revision of the accepted geological history of the region. It does not require any extension of the human occupation timeline. It requires only the recognition that the cave system implied by the hydrological data is real and extensive, which the scan data now provides. This part of the story is within the comfort zone of mainstream geological science, and it is the part that is most likely to receive formal publication and recognition in the near term. The human story is the part that takes longer. It is the part that requires the combination of the geological evidence with the cultural evidence and the linguistic evidence and the archaeological anomalies and the traditional knowledge, and that requires academic disciplines to talk to each other across boundaries that are not always easy to cross. It is the part that requires the institutional processes to catch up with the knowledge that the collaborating researchers and community members already possess. And it is the part that, when it is fully told and formally documented, will require the most significant revision of established narratives about who was where and when in North America. But the process is moving. In the informal networks of researchers and knowledge holders who are engaged with this question, a consensus is forming that the underground network of the Canadian Rockies is real, extensive, and connected to the human history of the region in ways that are both ancient and ongoing. The formal documentation of that consensus is a matter of time and process. The underlying reality is not waiting for the documentation. The copper found in certain locations in the Rocky Mountain region is worth discussing in the context of the underground network because copper processing in pre-contact North America is one of the areas where the conventional timeline has always been most pressured by the evidence. Native copper, pure metallic copper that occurs naturally in certain geological formations, was worked by indigenous peoples across North America for thousands of years. It was hammered, annealed, shaped into tools and ornaments. It was traded over enormous distances. Copper from the Lake Superior Basin appears in burial mounds throughout the eastern continent. Copper from sources in the Rocky Mountain and Plateau regions appears in trade assemblages that span from the Pacific coast to the Great Plains. The copper trade required knowledge of where the copper was, how to extract it, and how to transport it. Some of that knowledge is relatively recent in the archaeological record, but the copper itself suggests older relationships with the mineral resources of the mountain interior. Copper occurs in association with specific geological formations that in the Rocky Mountain region are found at depth in the same zone of thrust fault structures that the cave network occupies. The relationship between the underground passages and the geological formations that host native copper in the region is not coincidental. The passages follow the faults. The faults also host the copper deposits. People with knowledge of the underground passages would have had knowledge of the copper. This is not the only mineral resource that appears in association with the underground network geology. Chert and other fine-grained siliceous rocks, suitable for knapping high-quality stone tools, occur in specific formations within the thrust fault zone. The distribution of those formations and the distribution of quarry sites for those rock types in the archaeological record of the region suggests that the people who quarried the stone had knowledge of the subsurface geology that is not easily explained by surface observation alone. The best quarries are in locations where the target formation is exposed by erosion or faulting, but the ability to predict where the best material would be found in a complex geological landscape requires either extensive surface survey over a very long period or knowledge of what lies beneath the surface. The traditional knowledge of the Blackfoot, the Katunaxa, and the Stony Nakoda includes specific knowledge of where to find high-quality stone for tools, knowledge that is embedded in their oral traditions, and that guided their quarrying activities up to and through the contact period. The locations that these traditions identify as sources of good stone correspond in many cases with the geological formations that the thrust fault mapping identifies as the most likely hosts for the target rock types. The correspondence is not perfect because the geological mapping and the traditional knowledge are working from different reference systems, but it is consistent enough to suggest that the traditional knowledge includes information about the subsurface geology of the region that goes beyond what could be derived from surface observation alone. The connection between underground knowledge and mineral resource knowledge in the cultures of the Rocky Mountain peoples is a thread that leads deep into questions about the nature and history of those cultures that archaeology has not yet fully engaged. The standard narrative of hunter-gatherer subsistence strategies does not include extensive knowledge of subsurface geology. It focuses on surface resources, on the plants and animals and water sources that are directly observable and accessible. But the peoples of the Rockies have always known things about what is inside the mountains that are not explicable through surface observation, and the mineral resources of the mountain interior are part of that knowledge alongside the passages and chambers and underground water systems. The possibility that the underground network provided access to mineral resources, that it was used not only as a route of travel and a place of shelter and ceremony, but also as a means of accessing stone and copper and other materials that occur in the geological formations of the thrust fault zone, adds another dimension to the question of what the passages meant in the human history of the region. Routes of travel and sources of raw materials are among the most durable and significant features of a human landscape. They are the things that people come back to, generation after generation, that they maintain knowledge of across long time spans, that they defend and negotiate over and build cultural significance around. The underground network of the Canadian Rockies, if it served these functions, would be expected to be exactly what the traditions describe it as being: central, tried, important, known in detail, maintained in memory across the full duration of human presence in the region. There is a specific type of geological feature, relatively rare in most mountain environments but documented in several locations in the Canadian Rockies, that serves as a landmark for the underground network in a way that is directly visible from the surface. These are called karst windows, places where the roof of a cave passage has collapsed, leaving an opening in the surface that looks down into the underground world below. Karst windows can be small, barely large enough to put a hand through, or they can be substantial openings that allow passage of a human body, or even, in the largest cases, provide enough light to illuminate a section of the cave below. The Rockies have documented karst windows in several areas, and the positions of several of them correspond with the scan data in ways that are consistent with them sitting above portions of the underground network. One window in the Bow Valley area, documented by the National Park Service in the 1980s and noted in the geological literature as an interesting but minor feature, sits in the slope above the valley floor at a location that the scan data places directly above a junction between two passages of the network. The window has been known to the Stony Nakoda as a significant location for as long as the community's oral history extends. It has a specific name that translates as the eye of the stone, the eye through which the mountain looks out, the window through which the mountain breathes on certain days in certain weather conditions, a breath that is noticeable to anyone who stands near the opening and pays attention. The caving community has noted this window. The Geological Survey noted it in the 1980s. The Stony Nakoda have known it for longer than either of those communities has existed as a distinct entity, and the scan data says there is a passage junction below it. All of these observations are consistent with each other and consistent with what you would expect if the underground network is what the data suggests it is. The window looks both ways, the mountain looks out through it, but the person standing at the window can also look in, not far, because the opening is not large and the cave below is dark, but far enough to see that there is something there, that the mountain is not solid, that behind the surface of rock there is space and dark, and the possibility of something that has no name in the surface world's vocabulary. Children who grew up near that window in the traditional Stony Nakoda communities knew not to approach it alone. Not because it was physically dangerous, though it was, a fall into the darkness would not end well, but because it was a place that belonged to the underground world and required the proper relationship to approach safely. The protocol for approaching such places, the behaviors that are appropriate and those that are not, the knowledge that is necessary to move in those zones of intersection between the surface world and the underground world. This knowledge is encoded in the traditions and maintained by the community. The researchers who conducted the scanning survey were told about the window. They were brought to see it. They were given enough context about its significance to understand that it was not a feature to approach or document casually. Their response to that context, the degree of respect they brought to the situation, was part of what built the trust that allowed the broader collaboration to proceed. The underground network story is not just a geological story. It is a story about the relationship between different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of knowers, and about what becomes possible when that relationship is built with care. The care required is real. The knowledge that the communities hold about the underground is not abstract or theoretical. It is practical and specific, and has been maintained at significant cultural cost across a period of history, the contact period and its aftermath, that was profoundly destructive to indigenous cultures across North America. The loss of ceremonial practices, the suppression of languages, the removal of communities from their traditional territories, all of these forces acted against the preservation of the very knowledge that the scientific investigation now needs. That the knowledge survived is remarkable. That it is now being offered in a context of collaboration, rather than withheld as the only remaining protection against a history of exploitation, requires a response from the scientific community that acknowledges the cost of its survival. The researchers involved in this collaboration, the ones who have spoken about it in informal contexts, describe a process of learning how to be in a relationship with knowledge, rather than simply extracting knowledge as a resource. This is a different way of engaging with information than academic science normally practices. Academic science treats information as something to be gathered, processed, and published, with credit going to the researchers who did the gathering and processing. The knowledge that the communities hold about the underground is not organized that way. It is relational knowledge, held in a web of relationships between people and places, between the living and the ancestors who maintained the knowledge before them. Engaging with it requires engaging with those relationships, not just extracting the data points. This is a slow process. It is also, by the accounts of the people involved, a transformative one. The researchers who have engaged with the community knowledge about the underground come back from those engagements with their understanding of what scientific investigation is for changed. Not just informed by additional data, changed in their sense of what the investigation is trying to accomplish and what it means to accomplish it well. This change in the investigators is part of what the investigation is producing, alongside the scan data and the archive notes and the hydrological measurements. The underground is doing something to the people who are learning to pay attention to it. It is making them think differently about the surface world they return to from their encounters with what lies beneath. The mountain does not care about this, but the people do, and the people are the ones who will write the story of what was found. The oldest known maps in human history are not maps of the surface, they are maps of the underground. Cave systems in the Dordogne region of France contain markings that researchers have interpreted as spatial representations of the caves themselves. notational systems that allowed travelers to orient themselves in a darkness where the ordinary surface landmarks of orientation, the sun, the horizon, the shape of the land, were not available. The cave painter was not just an artist making images for their visual impact. The cave painter was also a cartographer, recording the shape of the underground world in a form that could be communicated to others and used to navigate a space that was genuinely and potentially fatally confusing without a guide. The parallels with the Canadian Rockies situation are not precise, but they are suggestive. The oral traditions that describe the underground passages are, among other things, navigational texts. They encode information about the shape and character of the passages in a form that can be memorized and used to guide travel through them. The level of specificity in some of the traditional descriptions, the details about passage height and width, about where the floor rises and falls, about where water is present and in what form, about where specific kinds of rock appear on the walls, is the level of specificity that navigational memory requires. You do not remember those things about a place unless you have used the knowledge to navigate through it, or unless you learned the knowledge from someone who did. The navigational memory encoded in the traditions is one of the most powerful arguments for taking those traditions seriously as historical records rather than as symbolic constructions. Navigational memory is conservative. It does not embellish usefully. An incorrect detail about the floor level in a passage can get you killed in the dark, or at minimum, leave you unable to find the route you need. Navigational traditions about real places are maintained with unusual accuracy across generations because the cost of inaccuracy is immediate and practical rather than abstract and eventual. The traditions that describe the Rocky Mountain underground network have the character of navigational memory. They have the specificity and the conservatism of knowledge that was maintained because it was used. The use of the knowledge, the actual practice of underground travel through the passages of the Rocky Mountain network, is something that the traditions describe as continuing until relatively recently. Not ancient history from the perspective of the communities that hold the traditions, but within the memory of elders who were alive within the last 150 years. The contact period and its aftermath disrupted many practices that had been continuous for much longer periods, and underground travel is among them. The routes that were known and used for millennia became routes that were no longer safe to use in the changed social and political environment of the reservation period. When movement off the designated territories was restricted and the old relationships with specific places in the landscape were actively suppressed by the policies of the colonial governments. This disruption is part of why the knowledge, though it survived, is incomplete in some respects. The elders who remembered the roots in the living tradition of the early 20th century were not able to pass that knowledge on in the full practice-based way that it would normally have been transmitted. They could tell the stories. They could describe the passages and the places, but they could not take their students into the underground and teach through experience the way the knowledge had always been taught before. What survived in the oral tradition is the verbal encoding of knowledge that was originally embodied, learned through physical navigation rather than through description. The verbal encoding is extraordinarily rich by the standards of what typically survives in oral tradition, but it is not the same as the full embodied knowledge that would exist if the tradition of underground travel had continued without interruption. The researchers who are collaborating with the communities are aware of this gap. They are aware that what they are hearing from elders and knowledge holders is not the complete knowledge, but a transmission through a channel that was narrowed by history. The completeness of the picture they can assemble from the oral tradition, even combined with the instrumental data, is limited by the damage that a century and a half of colonial policy did to the living practice of the knowledge. This limitation is part of the full, honest account of what is known about the underground network and how the knowing was produced. It is also, in the framing of the communities themselves, part of why the scientific investigation matters to them as well as to the researchers. The instrumental data can confirm things that the verbal tradition describes, but cannot fully verify, because the practice that would have been the ultimate verification was disrupted. In a specific sense, the scans are helping the communities recover knowledge that history prevented them from maintaining in its original form. The science is not replacing the traditional knowledge. In this case, it is helping to restore it. This dimension of the collaboration, the way scientific investigation can serve the purposes of community knowledge recovery, as well as the purposes of academic inquiry, is not often discussed in the formal literature of science-indigenous knowledge collaboration. The literature tends to focus on the protection of traditional knowledge from appropriation, on the importance of community consent, on the question of intellectual property over traditional knowledge. All of these are real and important concerns, but they can obscure the possibility that the collaboration itself, when done well, can be genuinely generative for all parties. The communities get something from the scientific investigation that they could not get from their own resources alone. The scientists get something from the community knowledge that their instruments could not provide alone. The collaboration produces a more complete understanding than either party brings to it independently. The underground network of the Canadian Rockies is, in this sense, doing what the underground always does in human experience. It is changing the people who engage with it. It is making them larger. It is making them think in longer timescales and in deeper dimensions than the surface world ordinarily requires. It is making visible the connections between things that appear separate on the surface. The surface world shows you rivers running in separate watersheds to different oceans. The underground shows you the same water moving through the mountain from one watershed to another, making connections that the surface topography denies. The surface world shows you cultures with different languages and different traditions occupying separate territories. The underground shows you the possibility that those cultures have deeper connections than their surface differences would suggest. Connections, through shared experience, of the same physical underground world across a time span that separates them from each other in some ways and connects them in others. The metaphor of the underground as a place of connection is one that appears in traditions from many parts of the world. The underworld of Greek mythology is not just a place of the dead. It is the place from which things come and to which things return, the generative darkness that underlies the visible world. The Aztec tradition of Aztlan, the mythological place of origin, is described in ways that have been variously interpreted as a real geographical location and as a symbolic description of the underground world from which human life emerged. The Aboriginal Australian traditions of the Dreamtime describe a dimension of reality that is not spatially separate from the surface world, but is a different mode of relationship with the landscape, one in which the deep connections between surface features that appear separate are made visible. The Canadian Rockies traditions are not claiming that the underground is everything. They are claiming that it is a significant part of everything, a part that the surface world does not reveal, and that requires a different kind of attention to perceive. The scan data is a different kind of attention. It is attention that goes below the surface by a method that the surface world itself has produced. The instruments that the researchers point at the mountains are products of the same Western scientific tradition that has, in other contexts, been dismissive or destructive of the traditional knowledge that the underground network embodies. The fact that the instruments are now producing data that converges with the traditional knowledge is a moment of reckoning for that scientific tradition. It is being asked to recognize that the methods it dismissed and the knowledge it ignored were telling the truth about a physical reality that its own instruments are now confirming. This reckoning is not comfortable. It is not supposed to be. The discomfort is information. The discomfort tells you that you are at the boundary of what your current framework can hold, that the framework needs to expand to accommodate something it excluded before. The Canadian Rockies underground network and the story of its rediscovery through the convergence of scientific instruments and traditional knowledge is one of the places where that expansion is being demanded by the evidence. The expansion will happen because the evidence is real and it is accumulating and it does not conform to the existing framework. The only question is how much resistance the expansion encounters before it is accepted, and at what cost to the knowledge and the people who maintained it through the period of resistance. The cost has already been significant. The knowledge that survived the contact period and its aftermath, the knowledge that is now being brought into conversation with the scan data, survived at the cost of the people who maintained it. The elders, who held the oral traditions of the underground through the suppression of indigenous cultural practices, did so at personal and community cost that the scientific investigation should not be able to ignore. The knowledge is not a free resource. It is the product of human lives and human suffering and human determination, and treating it as freely available data to be incorporated into scientific papers without acknowledging its provenance and its cost would be a continuation of the pattern of extraction that has characterized the relationship between Western science and indigenous knowledge for centuries. The researchers who are working on this project are, by the accounts available, trying to do it differently. The structures of the collaboration, the community consultation processes, the agreements about how findings will be published and credited, the involvement of community members as co-investigators rather than as informants, all of these are attempts to build a different kind of relationship between scientific investigation and traditional knowledge. Whether they fully succeed is something that only the communities involved can ultimately judge, but the attempt is being made, and the fact that the communities are participating is evidence that the attempt is at least partially working. The Southern Rocky Mountain cluster of anomalies, the one that lies closest to the traditional territories of the Ktunaxa, and that shows the strongest correspondence between the scan data and the spatial descriptions in the traditional knowledge, is the cluster most likely to be the site of the first physical investigation. The geographic and jurisdictional factors are somewhat more favorable there than in the park areas further north, and the collaboration with the Ktunaxa community has been the most developed. The specific location of the most accessible entry point into the network in this cluster has been identified from the community knowledge and confirmed by surface observations and shallow ground-penetrating radar. It is a place where the cave network comes close to the surface in a formation that, under the right conditions, would allow entry by experienced cavers with appropriate equipment. The conditions that make entry possible are technical rather than simply physical. The passage at the identified entry point is too tight for comfortable human passage in its current state. The limestone at that location has been partially blocked by sediment accumulation and calcite deposition over thousands of years. The passage that the traditional knowledge describes, and that the scan data implies was once traversable at this location, has been constricted by natural geological processes to the point where it is currently not accessible without some form of clearance work. That work, which in a cave context means careful manual removal of sediment and calcite without disturbing the material in ways that would damage its scientific value or its cultural significance, is within the technical capability of the caving and speleological research community. It requires planning, appropriate equipment, and the cooperation of the community, all of which are being organized. The passage beyond the constricted entry point, according to the scan data, opens within a short distance into a section of the network where the passage dimensions are substantial and where the first of the anomalous acoustic signatures is located. If the investigation reaches that point, and if what is there is what the scan data and the traditional knowledge suggest, the researchers will be standing in a place that no documented expedition has reached, examining material that may contain the physical record of human presence in the Canadian Rockies across a time span that currently accepted archaeology says is not possible. That moment, if and when it comes, will not be a television moment. It will not be a dramatic revelation in the chamber of a secret history. It will be a moment of careful, methodical scientific work in a cold, dark, physically demanding environment, surrounded by the geological record of a mountain range that has been accumulating its own history for 80 million years. The human story, if it is there, will be embedded in the geological story, and distinguishing them will require the same kind of patient, skilled analytical work that all significant archaeological discoveries require. The moment will not resolve the questions. It will begin a new phase of inquiry into them, but it will also be, for the people in that chamber, a moment of genuine encounter with something that has been present and unknown for a very long time. That quality of encounter, the first time a human being in the modern world touches something that was left by a human being in a world that the modern world has almost no memory of, is not reducible to data points. It carries a weight that the instruments that sent the researchers there cannot measure. The mountain breathes, the passages are there, and whatever they contain has been waiting for the encounter for longer than any story currently tells. The wait is nearly over. The question of whether the Rocky Mountain underground network extends beyond the current Canadian National Territory is one that the existing scan data cannot definitively answer, but that the geological and hydrological evidence strongly suggests should be taken seriously. The limestone formations of the Canadian Rockies do not stop at the international border. They continue into Montana, into Idaho, into the broader mountain system that geologists call the Western Cordillera. The thrust fault structures that control the cave network in the Canadian section of the range extend continuously into the American section. The cave systems of Glacier National Park in Montana, which are known to be extensive and which have been only partially explored, are almost certainly related to the Canadian network at the geological level, connected not necessarily by continuous open passages, but by the same structural and lithological controls that produced both. The traditions of the Blackfoot Confederacy, whose territory historically spanned the international border on both sides, describe underground features on the American side of the mountains that have the same character as the features described on the Canadian side. The Blackfoot territory was effectively divided by the international border in ways that the territory itself, as a geographic and ecological reality, was not. The people who knew the landscape moved across the border before the border existed and maintained knowledge of places on both sides. Their traditional knowledge does not respect the political line that the governments of the United States and Canada drew through their territory in the 19th century, and there is no reason to expect that the cave network does either. The American researchers and institutions that would need to be involved in any investigation of the southern extension of the network are not currently engaged with the question at the same level as the Canadian project. The conversation has begun, informally, through the same networks of researchers and community members that have been driving the Canadian investigation, but the formal processes required to conduct scanning surveys and physical investigations in the American national parks that overlie the relevant geological formations are separate from those in Canada and would need to proceed on a separate track. The timeline for American involvement, if it develops, is uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the mountain range does not know or care about the border. The water moves through the rock according to geological logic, not political logic. The passages that the thrust faults control run according to the history of the rock, not the history of the nation-states that now claim authority over the surface above them, and the traditional knowledge that the peoples of the region maintain about the underground does not divide itself at the 49th parallel. The knowledge is about the landscape, which is one landscape, one geological entity, one interconnected system of rock and water and passage and chamber, whose above-ground political organization is an extremely recent overlay on a reality that was there long before any human drew a line across it. The story of the Rocky Mountain Underground Network is, among other things, a story about the difference between human time and geological time. Human political organizations, nation-states, empires, civilizations, all exist on timescales that the mountain barely notices. The thrust faults that produce the rock formations hosting the cave network began moving 80 million years ago. The dissolution that carved the passages began tens of millions of years ago. The glacial cycles that shape the surface world are measured in hundreds of thousands of years. The human occupation of the region, whether it began 12,000 years ago, as the conventional timeline holds, or substantially earlier as the underground scenario suggests, is, from the mountain's perspective, a very recent development, and yet the mountain has been shaped by that human presence in subtle ways. The patterns of fire in the landscape above, maintained over thousands of years by the deliberate burning practices of the peoples of the region, have influenced the distribution of vegetation and the flow of water in ways that affect the cave environment below. The selective hunting of certain animal species, maintained over long periods by the knowledge systems of the regional cultures, has shaped the ecosystems that interact with the cave entrances and the biotic communities of the cave interiors. The ceremonial practices performed at specific underground locations have left traces in the archaeology of those locations that future investigation may be able to read. The mountain and the people have been in relationship for a long time, and that relationship has left marks on both parties. This is what traditional knowledge means when it describes the underground world as living, not as a metaphor for the spiritual significance of the place. As a literal description of an entity, the mountain, that has been in relationship with the human community for a time span sufficient to produce mutual influence, mutual shaping, the kind of co-evolution that happens between any species that have shared an environment long enough. The mountain is not alive in the way a person or an animal is alive, but it is not simply inert material either. It is a complex physical system, geologically active, hydrologically dynamic, biologically inhabited at every level, from its deep microbial communities to the large fauna that use its surface and caves. and it has been in contact with one of the most cognitively complex species the planet has ever produced for long enough that neither party is exactly what it would have been without the encounter. The encounter continues. The scans are the latest chapter. The physical investigation, when it begins, will be another chapter. The formal publication, when it comes, will be another. The revisions of the archaeological timeline, the rewriting of the story of human presence in the Americas that the evidence demands, will be another. And the communities that have maintained the knowledge of the underground through the long period when that knowledge was neither officially acknowledged nor safely expressible, those communities will be part of every chapter as they have been part of the whole story from the beginning. The beginning is earlier than we thought. The mountain has always known this. Now, slowly, the people who came to the mountain with instruments are beginning to know it too. There is a temperature at which the water in the deep passages of the Rocky Mountain network is relatively constant throughout the year. The instruments that have been used to measure it indirectly, through the chemical signatures of the spring water and the temperature profiles of the hot spring systems, place it somewhere between 4 and 8 degrees Celsius in the cold water portions of the network and substantially higher in the thermally active portions near the deep circulation systems. 4 to 8 degrees is cold by any comfort standard. It would make sustained habitation in the passages difficult without the kinds of cold weather technology that the peoples of the Rocky Mountain region are known to have possessed. But it is above freezing, critically, fundamentally above freezing, at a time when the surface world was locked in a glacial cycle that produced temperatures dozens of degrees below zero for months at a time. Above freezing means water is liquid. Liquid water means biological activity. Biological activity means resources that a human community could, in principle, use to supplement what they brought in from outside. The cave systems of the world that have been studied in this regard support communities of microorganisms, invertebrates, and in some cases vertebrates that derive their energy from chemosynthetic processes independent of sunlight. The biomass is small by surface standards, but in the context of a community that has access to stored food, the ability to travel through the underground to surface areas that remain accessible in winter, and the technological capacity to make the thermal environment tolerable, it is not negligible. The question of how a community would survive in the underground during the glacial maximum is not a question with a single answer. It is a question with a range of possible answers, each involving a different balance of stored resources, underground resources, access to surface areas that remained partially habitable, and technological adaptation to the thermal and physical challenges of the underground environment. Any of these answers would produce a community that looked different from what the standard model of pre-contact indigenous culture assumes, because the standard model does not account for the possibility of extended underground habitation under glacial conditions. The descendants of such a community, if they existed, would carry specific adaptations, technological and cultural, and possibly biological, that reflect the underground experience of their ancestors. Some of those adaptations would be visible in the archaeological record once the right questions are asked. Others would be visible in the cultural traditions, in the specific knowledge and practices that have no obvious surface world explanation but make immediate sense in an underground context. And others might be visible in the biological record, in the genetics of the populations descended from the underground survivors, in the ways that their immune systems and their physiological responses to certain environmental conditions differ from populations whose ancestors did not have the underground experience. The genetics of indigenous populations in the Rocky Mountain region have been studied, but not with this question in mind. The genetic surveys that have been conducted were designed to address other questions, primarily about migration routes and population relationships, within the framework of the standard settlement model. They were not designed to look for signatures of extended underground habitation. Whether the right analytical tools and the right questions, applied to the genetic data that already exists, or to new samples collected with this question specifically in mind, would find such signatures is something that cannot be determined without trying. The trying has not yet happened, partly because the hypothesis it would test is not yet in the formal scientific literature, in a form that would justify a dedicated genetic investigation. The underground scenario, the possibility that some populations survived the glacial maximum, in the passages of the Canadian Rockies, is still in the phase of informal circulation and informal investigation. When it reaches formal publication, and the evidence suggests that this transition is not far off, the range of investigations it would justify expands considerably. Genetics, archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, geology, hydrology, all of these fields have questions to ask of the underground network that they have not yet had the formal justification to pursue. The underground is not going anywhere. The stone will hold what it holds until the investigation is ready to receive it. The traditions will maintain what they maintain until the process is ready to engage with them fully. And the researchers who are currently in the awkward position of knowing more than they can formally publish, of having data that exceeds the framework in which it was collected, will continue to build the case until the case is strong enough to carry the paradigm shift that the evidence demands. The mountain breathes, the water moves through the dark, the passages are real. The people who knew them first are still here, and their knowledge is still alive, and they are ready, on their own terms, for the encounter with a science that is finally beginning to look in the right direction. What lies beneath the Canadian Rockies is not a secret. It was never a secret to the people who knew it. It was a silence imposed by a history that dismissed what those people knew. The lifting of that silence, the recognition that the underground network is real and significant, and that the knowledge of it has been preserved in the traditions of the peoples of the region, across a time span that exceeds the accepted history of human presence in the Americas, is not a discovery in the ordinary sense. It is a return to a knowledge that was always present, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to be fully heard. Those conditions are assembling themselves now, from the data and the collaboration and the changing relationship between scientific inquiry and indigenous knowledge. The return is beginning. The underground is opening, not to the first explorers, but to the latest ones. And the mountain that has been breathing through all of it, through the glacial maximum and the deglaciation and the millennia of human life in its passes and valleys and deep chambers, will continue to breathe through whatever comes next. Patient, dark, alive in its geological way, holding the record of everything that has happened in its interior since the first water found the first fracture in the first limestone formation that the ancient sea had built. The record is there. The people who can help read it are ready. The instruments have shown that something is there to read. The rest is time and care, and the willingness to accept what the evidence says, even when what it says requires the largest revision of the story of human presence in North America that the scientific community has ever been asked to make. That revision is coming. The mountain has all the patience in the world. The question is whether the people who are studying it will have enough of their own. The passages run northeast and southwest, following the grain of the mountains that were thrust into place 80 million years ago. They run through rock that was once the floor of a warm sea. They pass through limestone laid down by creatures that have no living descendants, creatures whose shells and skeletons became the stone that became the cave. They connect valleys, whose rivers run in different directions, and mountains whose peaks are separated by terrain that the surface traveler must climb and descend. They go through the bones of the continent, and at certain depths, at certain locations distributed through the network in the pattern that the scan data has now revealed, there are places where the rock is not the same as the rock around it, where the acoustic signatures say that something is present that is not stone and not air and not water, something that was left by something that was not the geological processes that shaped the rest of the underground world, something that has been waiting in the dark for a very long time. The instruments have pointed the way. The traditions have named the places. The investigation will go there and see what is there to be seen. And whatever it finds, it will find in a space that the mountain carved over millions of years, and that humans learned to inhabit and to know and to remember across a span of time that the history books have not yet found a way to hold. The history books will be revised. The cave will be entered. The record will be read. And the story of how people came to be in this part of the world, a story that has always been longer and older and more complex than the official version admitted, will become a little more complete. Not finished. Stories like this are never finished, but more complete, more honest, more full of the actual complexity and depth of what it means to be human in a landscape this old, this large, this fundamentally indifferent to human categorizations and human timelines and human assumptions about what is possible and what is not. The mountain breathes, and the story, at last, begins to breathe with it. There is something that experienced cavers describe that people who have spent extended time in large cave systems all seem to come back from, with a shift in their relationship to time. The underground, where there is no daylight and no seasonal change and no weather and no horizon, removes the ordinary cues by which the surface-dwelling mind measures the passage of time. An hour underground can feel like a day. A day underground can compress into what feels like a few hours. The sense of the present moment expands because there is nothing pulling it toward the future in the way that the urgencies of the surface world do. You are simply there, in the dark, in the cold and the silence, aware of the weight of the rock above you and the depth of the rock below. People who have this experience often describe it as a kind of humility, not the humility of inadequacy, of being small before something large. The humility of proportion, the recognition that the human moment, even the long human moment of history and prehistory, and the full span of our existence as a species, is a thin layer on something much more ancient and much more patient. The cave does not care about human history. The limestone was laid down before any mammal walked on the surface above it. The passages were carved by water that was moving through the rock before our evolutionary ancestors had the brain structures that produce self-awareness. And yet humans are in the cave. Humans have been in the cave. Their presence there is part of the cave story now, whether the cave knows it or not, because the humans left traces, and those traces are being read, or will be read when the investigation finally reaches the places where they are. The human story is embedded in the geological story, and the geological story provides the context that makes the human story possible, and neither story is complete without the other. This is what the underground network of the Canadian Rockies teaches, or begins to teach, to the people who are willing to follow it into the dark. Not a lesson about human superiority, or geological dominance, or the triumph of either science or tradition over the alternative. A lesson about depth, about the layers upon layers of story that any real place contains, and about the attention required to begin to read them. The mountain has been telling its story for 80 million years. The people of the mountain have been telling theirs for as long as they have been there. The scientists are the newest narrators, and they are just beginning to understand the story they have joined. The joining is what matters, not the priority, not the credit, not the question of who knew first or who knows better. The joining is what makes it possible to understand what the mountain is actually saying, in all the languages it speaks, geological and hydrological and cultural and linguistic and traditional and scientific, and all the others that have not yet been applied to it. The mountain breathes, the passages are there, the knowledge is there, the investigation is coming, and the story, which has always been there, is beginning to be told in the full voice that it deserves. Rest in that for a moment, in the dark of the underground, in the cool, constant temperature of the deep passages, in the sound of the mountain breathing around you, and the weight of 80 million years of rock above. Rest in the recognition that you are part of a story that is much longer than any human institution has yet been willing to acknowledge. That the ground beneath the mountains you can see is not empty. That the traditions that describe what is inside those mountains are not metaphors. That the people who maintained those traditions through the long period of their suppression did something important and real and costly that deserves recognition and respect. And that the investigation that is finally beginning to look in the right direction, with the right instruments and the right collaborations and the right humility, is not just a scientific project. It is a restoration of something that was always true, and that was, for too long, not permitted to be known. The mountain has been patient, the knowledge has been patient, the passages have been patient. Now, at last, the investigation is beginning to match that patience. And what it finds, when it goes where the data and the traditions are pointing, will change the story of who we are and how long we have been here, and what we have known and carried and preserved across the full depth of human time. The passages are real, the network is there, the records of what happened inside are waiting, and the mountain, as it has always done, is breathing, slowly, in the dark, in the cold, through the full span of geological time that makes human history look like a single long breath, drawn and exhaled in a moment of the rock's attention. Follow the breath, follow the passages, Follow the data and the traditions and the water and the language and all the threads that pull toward the same place, the deep interior of the oldest landscape in the western part of this continent, and listen for what the mountain has to say when everything that has been trying to silence it is finally set aside and the true inquiry can begin. The Canadian Rockies are not finished giving up their secrets. They have barely started. What the scans found beneath the stone is not the end of the mystery. It is the beginning of the next chapter of a story that has been running for longer than we have been able to tell it. That chapter is opening now, slowly, in the way that mountains do everything, with the patience of stone and the endurance of water and the quiet persistence of knowledge that has survived everything that history threw at it, because it was true, and because the people who held it understood that truth is worth the cost of keeping. The passages run through the dark. The water finds its way. The mountain breathes. And somewhere, in the deep interior of the stone, in the chambers that the instruments have now revealed and that the traditions have always known, the record of what was is waiting to be read by the people who are finally, after all this time, looking in the right place. There are geologists who specialize in a field that most people outside the discipline have never heard of. It is called speleogenesis, the study of how caves form. It is a narrow specialty, even within geology, focused on the specific physical and chemical processes by which voids appear inside rock. Why certain formations produce caves and others do not. Why caves in similar rock types can look entirely different from each other. Why the same mountain can be solid in one location and riddled with passages in another. Speleogeneticists think about time in very long spans, because the processes they study operate slowly. A cave passage, a meter in diameter, might take tens of thousands of years to form by surface water dissolution. The same passage might form in a fraction of that time by ascending hot water under pressure. The difference between those timescales matters enormously for the interpretation of what the Canadian Rockies scan data is showing. The researchers who examined the scan data included a speleogeneticist who had previously worked on cave systems in the Alps and in the southern Appalachians, both of which share certain geological characteristics with the Canadian Rockies in terms of their thrust belt origin and their karst development. Her interpretation of the scan data, shared in a working paper that circulated among the project team, emphasized what she called the complexity of the Genesis signature. The network she was seeing in the data was not the product of a single cave-forming process. It showed evidence of multiple episodes of cave formation under different conditions, producing passages with different characteristics that were then connected by subsequent episodes of geological movement and dissolution. This complexity is geologically significant and archaeologically significant in equal measure. A cave network formed through multiple episodes over a very long period is one that has been available as a human resource across a very long period. Passages formed in one geological episode create potential routes that humans can use in a subsequent period when the climate or the surface conditions make underground routes advantageous. Passages formed in a later episode can connect earlier passages to create a network that is more extensive than any single episode of cave formation would produce. The result, over millions of years, is a complex, interconnected system whose total extent exceeds what any single geological process could create, and whose availability to human use extends from the earliest period of human presence in the region to the present. The speleogeneticist's conclusion, stated carefully in her working paper, was that the network described by the scan data could have been available to human use in essentially its current configuration for at least the last 50,000 years, and possibly much longer. The processes of dissolution and passage formation that she identified in the data were sufficiently advanced in their development that the network would have been traversable as a continuous system during the period of the last glacial maximum. The passages would not have been blocked by the glacial ice because they were at depths that the ice did not reach. They would have had air circulation because the network's connectivity creates the barometric pressure differentials that drive cave breathing. And they would have had water because the deep circulation of groundwater through the thrust fault zone continued through the glacial period, feeding the passages from below rather than from the ice above. This is a critical technical point that deserves careful emphasis. The conventional assumption is that the last glacial maximum made the Canadian Rockies uninhabitable. that the region was effectively erased of human presence by the ice and then recolonized from outside as the ice retreated. This assumption is correct for the surface. The surface of the high Rockies during the glacial maximum was ice, kilometers of it, utterly devoid of any surface condition compatible with human life. But the assumption's application to the underground is not justified. The underground was not ice. The underground was rock and passage, and flowing water and cave air, as it has been for millions of years regardless of what the surface was doing. The distinction between surface and underground conditions during the glacial maximum is not a subtle one, it is an absolute one. The surface was uninhabitable, the underground was not. And if the underground was not uninhabitable, and if people had knowledge of the underground network and the means to use it, then the assumption that the region was completely depopulated during the glacial maximum requires revision. Not every person in the region, at the time of the glacial advance, would have had the knowledge and the means to survive underground. Not every community in the broader region would have been positioned to make use of the underground network as a refugium, but some might have been. Some, specifically the communities whose territories were most closely associated with the mountains and whose traditional knowledge most specifically described the underground network, might have been exactly the communities that were in the position to survive what erased everyone else on the surface. This is the hypothesis that the scan data makes newly urgent. It was not invented by the scan data. Versions of it have been circulating in discussions of indigenous oral traditions and alternative archaeological chronologies for decades, without the physical evidence to make it credible to mainstream scientific institutions. The scan data provides that physical evidence, or at least the beginning of it. It shows that the underground network that the hypothesis requires actually exists. The next step, which the physical investigation will provide, is to determine whether the network contains evidence of having been used in the way the hypothesis proposes. The investigation is the crucial step. Everything else in this story is prelude to what happens when researchers actually enter the passages that the instruments have described from outside. What they find there will either confirm the underground survival hypothesis in the specific and testable form that the scan data and the traditional knowledge together make possible, or it will require the hypothesis to be revised. Either outcome advances the knowledge. Either outcome is better than the current situation, in which the hypothesis is held in informal circulation because the physical evidence needed to test it formally has not yet been gathered. The investigators who will enter the passages carry with them all of the context that has been assembled in the years since the initial scanning surveys. They carry the geological interpretation of the speleogeneticist, the hydrological analysis of the water chemists, the acoustic interpretation of the seismic data specialists, the cultural knowledge provided by the Ktunaxa and Stony Nakoda and Blackfoot community members who have been part of the collaboration, the archived notes of the 1990s survey, the cavers' documentation of the anomalous air movement points, and the traditions that describe the passages in the language of navigational memory. They carry all of this into a space where none of it has ever been directly confirmed or disconfirmed by the physical experience of presence. What will it be like in the passages? The science provides parameters. The temperature will be cold, several degrees above freezing. The air will be still or moving slightly, depending on the external barometric pressure at the time of entry. The rock will be limestone in most sections, with variations where the passages cross different geological formations. The floor will carry sediment in some areas, bare rock in others, possibly ice formations in sections that receive cold air drainage from the surface. The acoustics will be unusual. The close-range sound properties of confined spaces with irregular walls and floor, rather than the open-air sound that human senses are calibrated for. Beyond the parameters, the experience is not something that can be predicted from the outside. Caves are individuated in ways that resist generalization. Each one has its own character, its own scale, its own particular quality of darkness and silence and geological personality. The passages of the Rocky Mountain network, if the scan data is correct about their dimensions and connectivity, will have a character that reflects their specific genesis, their specific rock types, their specific history of water flow and dissolution and mineral deposition. That character will be encountered directly, for the first time in the documented record of human exploration, by the people who go in. The people who go in will be scientists with equipment. They will carry lights and instruments and ropes and documentation tools. They will note and photograph and measure. They will take samples and mark locations with the precision required for subsequent analysis. They will do all of the things that scientific cave exploration requires, which is an extensive and demanding list of technical tasks in a physically challenging environment. And alongside all of that technical work, they will also simply be there, in the dark, inside the mountain, in a place that has been described in traditions and pointed to by instruments, but that has not been directly experienced in any recorded history. The two things will happen simultaneously: the scientific documentation and the human experience of presence in an extraordinary place. That is how it always works in significant exploration. The technical and the experiential cannot be separated. The person doing the technical work is also the person having the experience. The data and the encounter are produced together by the same act in the same moment, and both matter. The data is what the investigation is for, in the institutional sense. The encounter is what makes it matter to the humans involved and to the wider human community that is following the story. The wider human community is larger than it was before the scan data began circulating. The story of the Rocky Mountain Underground Network is moving through multiple channels simultaneously. The academic channel is the slowest, constrained by the review processes and the institutional conservatism that characterize formal scientific publication. The community channel, within the First Nations communities whose territories the network underlies, is ongoing and has its own rhythm and its own forms of communication. The broader public channel, which includes the informal academic networks, the caving and outdoor research communities, the alternative history researchers who have been tracking the story since the earliest leaked reports of the scan data, and now the audience for the kind of documentary storytelling that can carry complex scientific and historical narratives to a wide audience, is the fastest and the largest. You are part of that wider channel. The fact that you are listening to this, in whatever circumstances and at whatever hour you encounter it, means that the story has reached you through the public channel in one of its forms. The story is incomplete. It will remain incomplete for some time because the investigation is not finished and the formal documentation is not complete and the paradigm revision that the evidence demands is not yet accomplished. But incomplete stories are the only kind worth telling at this stage of an inquiry, because a story that waits for completeness waits forever. The world does not produce complete stories. It produces ongoing ones, stories in which each new development changes the context of everything that came before, and in which the only honest posture toward the story is the posture of openness to revision. The underground network of the Canadian Rockies is an ongoing story. The scan data is a chapter. The traditional knowledge is a chapter, written in a different script but telling about the same place. The geological history is a chapter, written in the language of stone. The hydrological analysis is a chapter, written in the language of water. The linguistic isolation of the Ktunaxa is a chapter, written in the language of historical divergence. The archive note of the 1990s surveyor is a chapter, written in the careless shorthand of a field log that became significant decades after it was made. The caver's documentation of the anomalous air movement is a chapter. The collaboration between the researchers and the communities is a chapter. The physical investigation, when it happens, will be a chapter. And the formal publication and the response of the academic community and the revision of the archaeological timeline of the Americas and the recognition of the traditional knowledge as historical evidence and all the subsequent investigations that the revised understanding will generate, each of those will be a chapter too. The book is long and it is still being written. You are listening to it in one of its middle sections. Not at the beginning, because the story began long before the instruments were invented that could image the underground from the surface. Not at the end, because the physical investigation has not yet happened and the formal revision of the human timeline of the Americas has not yet been accomplished. In one of the middle sections, where the evidence has been assembled and the hypothesis is formed and the investigation is imminent and the community is engaged and the knowledge is being held in the space between formal documentation and direct experience, waiting for the moment when both will be possible together. That moment is coming. The people involved in the project describe a quality of readiness in the current situation that is different from the earlier phases of the work. The conversations between the researchers and the community members have reached a depth of mutual understanding that makes the next step feel natural rather than forced. The technical preparation for the physical investigation is far enough advanced that the practical details are being planned rather than imagined. The institutional processes that authorize the investigation are progressing through their stages with what one researcher described as unprecedented cooperation from the national park authorities, who have been briefed on the scan data and who appear to appreciate the scientific significance of what is being proposed. The moment is assembling itself from its components, as significant moments do. When the passage is entered and the first light goes on in a space that has been dark since before any human light touched it, there will be a quality to that moment that no instrument can measure and no amount of prior preparation can predict. It will be the moment when the abstract knowledge, the scan data and the traditions and the hydrological analysis and the archived notes and all the rest becomes concrete. When the mountain becomes a place rather than a dataset. When the story of what lies beneath the Canadian Rockies becomes a story that can be told from the inside, from direct encounter, rather than from the outside through instruments and traditions and careful inference, that moment will change the story. Not because the story will be complete after it will not be complete, but because the nature of the story will be different. There is a quality of knowledge that comes from having been somewhere that cannot be produced in any other way. The cavers know this. The knowledge holders whose ancestors were in the underground know this, even though their knowing is transmitted through the tradition rather than through personal experience. The researchers who have been working on this project know it, in the sense that they are aware of what they do not yet know. The physical encounter will produce a form of knowing that is qualitatively different from anything that has preceded it in this investigation, and that will change the investigation in ways that cannot be predicted from the outside. This is the nature of exploration, not the production of confirmation for what is already believed, but the production of encounter with what is actually there, which is always more complex, more specific, more surprising, and more interesting than what was anticipated. The mountain has its own character, its own specific reality that exceeds any model of it that can be constructed from the outside. The investigation will encounter that specific reality and will have to revise its models accordingly. Some things that are expected will not be there. Some things that are not expected will be. The encounter will be specific, and the specificity will be information of the highest value, the kind that only direct experience can produce. The communities whose traditional knowledge has guided the investigation will encounter the findings of the physical investigation in their own way. The relationship between what their traditions describe and what the investigators find will be complex. Some descriptions will match, some will not. The mismatch between traditional description and instrumental finding, where it occurs, will be information too, about the ways that tradition encodes information, and the ways that encoding changes over time and through the filter of different communication contexts. The traditions are not expected to be perfect maps. They are expected to be what they are, which is the result of a very long process of human knowledge maintenance under changing conditions, preserving the core and adapting the periphery, and encoding information in forms that could survive the specific challenges of the historical period through which the knowledge was transmitted. The communities are ready for the complexity of that encounter. They have been living with the traditions long enough to understand that the traditions are not fixed texts, but living knowledge systems that absorb new information and change in response to it, while maintaining core commitments that are not negotiable. The scientific findings will be new information, absorbed into that living system in the way that new information always is, with the community's own epistemological standards applied to determine what is significant and what is not, what confirms what was known, and what requires the knowledge to expand or revise. The mountain holds all of this lightly. It holds the geological history and the hydrological story and the human traditions and the scientific data with equal indifference. The rock does not prefer one narrative of what it contains over another. The passages run where they run, regardless of whether anyone has mapped them. The anomalous acoustic signatures reflect what they reflect, regardless of whether anyone has interpreted them. The mountain is complete in itself, without the addition of human attention or human story or human investigation. But the humans are not complete without the mountain. The story of who we are, how long we have been here, how we survived what we survived, what knowledge we maintained through the most extreme conditions that the climate of this planet has produced, That story is not complete without what lies beneath the Canadian Rockies. The incompleteness is not a failure of the story. It is a description of the current state of human knowledge, which is always partial, always in process, always reaching toward a completeness that it approaches but does not attain. The underground is a particularly dramatic instance of that incompleteness, because the gap between what is known and what is inside the mountain is visible in such stark terms. The instruments have seen the inside of the mountain from the outside. The investigators have not yet been inside. That gap is closing, and the closing of it is one of the most significant scientific and historical events of the current period. When it closes, the story will change, not end, change. Become more specific, more grounded, more rooted in the direct encounter with what is actually there. The revision of the human timeline of the Americas, the recognition of the underground survival scenario as historically real, the acknowledgement of the traditional knowledge as historically accurate, the re-establishment of the full depth of human presence in the Canadian Rockies, all of this will change the story of this continent and the story of our species in ways that ripple outward far beyond the specific geography of the Rockies. The story of who we are is always partly the story of where we have been. The underground, for some portion of our ancestors, for longer than we have been willing to acknowledge, was aware. A real place, physically present, that they inhabited and navigated and used and understood and encoded in their traditions. The recognition of that reality is not just a scientific correction. It is a restoration of dignity to people whose knowledge was dismissed, and whose history was written for them by people who did not know what they knew, who did not know where they had been, who did not know how long they had been there or what they had survived to remain. The mountain breathes. The passages are real. The knowledge has survived. The investigation is coming. And when the light goes on in the dark chambers of the Canadian Rockies underground network, for the first time in the recorded history of this landscape, it will illuminate not just stone and sediment and the geological record of 80 million years. It will illuminate a chapter of human history that has been waiting in the dark for too long, maintained in the traditions of the peoples who lived it, pointed to by the instruments of a science that is finally looking in the right direction, and ready to be read by everyone who is willing to follow the breath of the mountain down into the stone and see what is there. That is what the scans found. Not just passages, not just chambers, not just geological anomalies that defy easy explanation, the beginning of a story that was always there. The first technical confirmation of what the mountain and the people who know it have always known. The opening of a door that has been sealed not by the rock, which has always been there, but by the assumptions of a science that was not yet ready to look where the evidence was pointing. The assumptions are yielding to the evidence. The door is opening, and the story that comes through it, slowly, in the patience of geological time and the endurance of traditional knowledge and the careful methodology of an investigation that is trying to do it right, that story will be worth the waiting. It has already been worth the waiting. It has been waiting for a very long time. The mountain breathes, and now, at last, the story breathes with it. For those of you drifting off to sleep as you listen to this, carry it with you into the dark. The darkness you are descending toward as sleep takes you is not so different from the dark of the underground passages. It has its own silence and its own temperature, and its own quality of remove from the surface world and its urgencies. And like the passages beneath the Rockies, it holds things, not geological things, not the records of ancient human habitation, but the records of your own day, your own questions, the things your mind has been working with and around and through, processed now in the slow chemistry of sleep rather than the fast chemistry of waking attention. The mountain does its work in geological time. Your sleeping mind does its work in biological time. Both are forms of the same fundamental process, the patient transformation of what is taken in into something that can be used, the slow conversion of experience into understanding. The cave does it with water and limestone. You do it with memory and synapse. The timescales are incomparably different. The fundamental logic is not. Rest now with the knowledge that beneath a mountain range in Western Canada, in the cold dark of passages carved by water and thrust fault and geological time, something is waiting that has been there long enough to outlast every human civilization that has ever risen and fallen. Something that the people who knew it first have described in their traditions with the specificity of navigational memory. Something that the instruments have now confirmed is there, real and extensive and connected and containing, in its anomalous acoustic signatures, the possibility of evidence that will change the story of this continent's human history. That story is not finished. It is beginning, again, from a place that was always there but not yet fully seen. The scans found a tunnel network beneath the Canadian Rockies. What that tunnel network holds is still, in the most literal sense, an open question. The investigation is coming, the knowledge is ready, the mountain is patient. And you, listening in the dark, are part of the circle of people who now know that the question exists, that the evidence is real, that the story is older and deeper and more extraordinary than the surface of the landscape reveals. Let that settle in as you drift towards sleep. The mountain breathes, the passages run through the stone, the traditions have always known, and now, at last, the rest of the world is beginning to listen. If you have made it this far, if the story of the underground Rockies has carried you through the night, or part of the night, or given you something to think about in whatever quiet hours you found for it, then you already know something about the patience that the investigation requires. You have practiced something of the same quality of sustained attention that the researchers bring to their work and that the communities bring to their knowledge. The ability to follow a thread through complexity and uncertainty and incompleteness, to stay with a story that does not resolve neatly, to trust that the direction the evidence points is worth following even when the destination is not yet clear. That is what the people investigating the Rocky Mountain Underground Network are doing. That is what the communities who maintained the knowledge through the long suppression were doing. That is what the mountain has always been doing, in its geological way, moving water through limestone, carving passages, building the record of what has happened inside it, across a span of time that makes the current moment look like a single breath. Stay curious. The story is not over. The investigation is coming. And whatever it finds beneath the Canadian Rockies will change the story of this continent and the story of our species in ways that will matter for a very long time. The mountain breathes. Now close your eyes and breathe with it. If you're still awake and want more stories like this one, the kind that sit at the edge of what is officially acknowledged and point toward what may yet be found, then subscribe and let the algorithm know that this kind of depth is what you are looking for. Leave a comment if you feel moved to. Tell me where you are in the world and what time it is there. I read every one. Someone listening in the Bow Valley in Alberta at this moment, a few hundred meters above passages that instruments say are real. Someone in Montana, above the southern extension of the network that the border divides on paper, but that the rock does not recognize. Someone somewhere far from the Rockies who is now thinking differently about what lies beneath the mountains in their own landscape, wondering what the instruments there might find if anyone pointed them in the right direction. All of you, listening in the dark, are part of the circle that the story makes. The mountain breathes. You breathe with it. And the underground, patient as it has always been, waits for the investigation that will finally tell us what has always been there. Good night. The passages are real. The knowledge has survived. And the story, at last, is beginning to be fully told. There are maps in the world that are famous for what they leave out. The early European maps of North America are famous for the blank spaces they contain, spaces labelled with phrases that translated roughly to, "Here is the unknown," or "Here is what we have not yet gone to," or simply nothing, an absence of ink where absence of knowledge was all there was to draw. Those blank spaces were not actually empty. They were full of geography, of ecology, of human settlements, and travel routes, and cultural landscapes that the mapmakers simply did not know about because they had not been there and had not yet spoken with the people who had. The blank spaces were a record of the mapmakers' ignorance rather than the landscape's emptiness. The blank space in the current understanding of the Canadian Rockies is not geographic in the surface sense. The surface of the Rockies is mapped in extraordinary detail. Satellite imagery, topographic survey, geological mapping, ecological inventory, all of these have been applied to the surface of the range with a thoroughness that leaves almost nothing undescribed. But the underground is a blank space in almost exactly the sense that the interiors of continents were blank spaces on early maps, known to exist, known to be significant, described with some accuracy by the people who had direct knowledge of it, but absent from the official record because the mapmakers, the geological and archaeological and historical institutions that produced the official record, had not been there and had not yet fully engaged with the knowledge of the people who had. The scan data is the beginning of filling in that blank. It is the equivalent of the first rough surveys that began to put contour lines into the empty interiors of the early maps. The lines are not precise, the resolution is limited, the interpretation is uncertain in many places. But the blank is no longer entirely blank. Something is there. Something with a shape, a distribution, a character that can be described even if it cannot yet be completely mapped. The first contour lines have been drawn. The blank space is acquiring the beginning of a detailed form. The process of filling in the blank will take time. All significant cartographic work takes time, because the territory being mapped does not cooperate with the convenience of the mapmakers. The underground of the Canadian Rockies is physically inaccessible in most of its extent. The passages that the instruments have imaged cannot be entered directly at most locations because they are too deep, too narrow at their surface connections, or in terrain that makes approach difficult. The portions that can be accessed are the portions near the surface, where the network comes close enough to the surface to allow human entry, and those portions are where the initial physical investigation will focus. The deeper portions of the network, the sections that follow the major thrust faults through the mountain routes, will require technical and logistical capabilities that are being developed, but that are not yet fully available. The blank will be filled in incrementally, over years rather than weeks, through a combination of continued instrumental surveying at greater depths and with improved technology, physical investigation of the accessible portions, and the ongoing collaboration with the communities whose traditional knowledge continues to provide the most specific and accurate guidance about where to look and what to look for. The completed map of the underground network of the Canadian Rockies is a long-term project, not a single expedition's work. But the project has begun, and the beginning is visible in the scan data and in the collaboration and in the readiness of the investigation that is now imminent. The geological complexity that makes the mapping difficult is also what makes the network significant. Simple cave systems, the ones formed by a single episode of dissolution in a simple geological setting, are relatively easy to understand and to map. The Rocky Mountain Network is none of those things. Its genesis is multiple and complex. Its geological setting is among the most complex in the world. A thrust belt environment where different rock types are stacked in unusual relationships, and where the faults that created those relationships continue to be active in ways that affect the cave environment. Its history spans a time frame that makes it one of the oldest cave systems on the continent, if the speleogeneticists' analysis is correct. And its relationship to the hydrological and thermal systems of the surrounding landscape is interconnected in ways that are not yet fully understood. Each of these dimensions of complexity is a research opportunity as well as an interpretive challenge. The network's geological complexity makes it a uniquely valuable laboratory for the study of cave genesis in thrust belt environments. Its hydrological connections to the surface drainage of the Columbia watershed make it important for understanding how water moves through the mountain landscape in ways that have direct practical implications for downstream communities. Its thermal connections to the hot spring systems of the Jasper area provide a window into the deep geothermal structure of the range. And its potential human history makes it significant for the understanding of the peopling of the Americas in ways that go beyond any other currently known underground site in North America. The research agenda that the network implies is extensive enough to occupy a generation of scientists, and this is before the physical investigation has confirmed what the instruments and the traditions together suggest is there. The confirmed existence of the network, which the scan data already establishes beyond reasonable doubt, is the scientific result that justifies the full research program. The contents of the network are the results that will define the next phase of inquiry and that will determine which of the current hypotheses are correct and which need revision. Among the researchers who are most eager to know what the physical investigation finds are the people who study the genetics of indigenous populations in the Rocky Mountain region. Not because genetics is their primary interest in this specific context, but because the underground survival hypothesis, if confirmed by evidence in the passages, has specific and testable genetic implications that they have the tools to investigate. If a population survived the glacial maximum in the underground refugia of the Rockies, their isolation during that period would have left signatures in their genome that can be detected and analyzed. The signatures would be visible as a period of reduced genetic diversity consistent with the size and duration of the refugium population followed by a period of expansion consistent with the recolonization of the surface after the ice retreated. These signatures are detectable with modern genomic analysis tools, but detecting them requires knowing where to look, which populations to analyze, and how to frame the analytical questions. The underground survival hypothesis provides exactly this framing. It tells the geneticists which populations to focus on. The Kotu-Naxa, whose linguistic isolation suggests the deepest roots in the region, the Stony Nakoda and Blackfoot, whose traditional territories are most closely associated with the underground network, and it tells them what kind of signature to look for, the specific demographic pattern that would be expected from an isolated refugium population, going through the glacial maximum, and then expanding as the surface became habitable. This kind of targeted genetic investigation has the potential to produce results that are much more specific and informative than the broad-stroke genetic surveys that have characterized the field to date. The genetics, if they confirm the underground survival hypothesis, would add a biological dimension to the evidence that is currently primarily geological and cultural, a biological signature of the underground period, visible in the genomes of the descendant populations, would be evidence of a kind that is very difficult to dismiss, even for the most skeptical reviewer. It would say not just that the underground was there, and not just that the traditions describe it, but that the human population that survived in it left a mark in the biology of its descendants that persists to the present day. That kind of multi-level convergence of evidence, geological and cultural and biological, would constitute the kind of case that paradigm-changing science requires before the paradigm actually changes. The underground is patient, but the accumulation of evidence is not slow. Each new analytical lens applied to the question produces new data. Each new conversation between the researchers and the community members produces new insights into the traditional knowledge and new questions for the physical investigation to address. Each new analytical technique applied to existing data produces results that either confirm or refine the current understanding. The pace of knowledge accumulation is accelerating, even as the institutional pace of formal recognition remains slow. The gap between what is known and what is formally acknowledged is growing rather than shrinking, and the pressure of that gap on the institutions that maintain the formal record will eventually produce the revision that the evidence demands. The mountain is patient because it has no choice. Stone does not hurry. But the researchers are not stone, and the community members are not stone, and the people who are following this story from the outside are not stone. The investigation will happen in human time, which is faster than geological time, and more pressured by the urgency of questions that people are genuinely, deeply curious about. What is in the mountain? What happened there? Who was there? And how long? And what did they leave? The urgency of those questions is part of what drives the investigation forward against the inertia of institutional processes and established paradigms. The curiosity is real, and it is powerful, and it is not going to go away until the questions have been answered. The answering is beginning. The beginning is visible in the scan data, and in the collaboration and in the readiness of the people and the processes. What comes next will be worth following. The story of the Canadian Rockies underground network is not unique in the sense of being the only story of its kind. There are other places in the world where similar convergences of geological data and traditional knowledge are producing similar challenges to established archaeological chronologies. The dating of human arrival in Australia keeps pushing back, each new analysis of the coastal and inland sites suggesting that the continent was reached earlier than the previous consensus held. The cave sites of the Indonesian archipelago are producing evidence of human symbolic behavior at dates that challenge the conventional timeline of cognitive development. The submerged landscapes of the North Sea and the Mediterranean are beginning to yield archaeological evidence of human occupation during the last glacial low sea level stand, evidence that was completely inaccessible before deep-water archaeological technology made it possible to investigate. The Canadian Rockies story is part of a global pattern. Across the world, in different geological and cultural contexts, the combination of new analytical technologies and the engagement with traditional knowledge is producing evidence that the human story is older, deeper, and more geographically extensive than the conventional academic models have been willing to acknowledge. The Rocky Mountain Underground Network is a particularly dramatic instance of this global pattern because the potential time extension is so large and because the survival mechanism, underground refugia during the glacial maximum, is so specific and so testable, but it is not an isolated anomaly. It is one piece of a picture that is being assembled from many directions simultaneously. The picture, when it is more complete than it currently is, will look like this. Human beings have been cognitively modern for much longer than the conventional timeline acknowledges. They have been geographically distributed more widely and more early than the conventional models predict. They survived the most extreme climatic events of the Pleistocene through a combination of technological, social, and environmental adaptation that included, in at least some regions, the use of underground refugia that were not erased by the ice that erased the surface. Their knowledge of those refugia and of the underground landscapes they navigated was maintained in oral traditions across timescales that modern scholarship has not been willing to assign to oral knowledge transmission, but that the specificity and accuracy of the traditions, now testable against physical data, demands must be revised upward. And the genetic and linguistic and cultural diversity of the world's indigenous peoples reflects, in part, the long periods of isolation that the refugia created, periods that allowed the deep divergence that produces language, isolates, and cultural distinctiveness that has no easy explanation in the shallow migration models of the conventional timeline. This is a large picture. It is a picture that requires substantial revision of established knowledge in multiple fields simultaneously. It is the kind of revision that academic disciplines resist for institutional and professional reasons that have nothing to do with the quality of the evidence, and that ultimately yield to the evidence when it is extensive and well documented and consistently confirmed across multiple independent lines of inquiry. The evidence for the Rocky Mountain Underground Network is becoming extensive. It is reasonably well documented in informal channels, if not yet in formal publications, and it is being confirmed across multiple independent lines: geological and hydrological and cultural and acoustic and archival. The resistance will yield, because the resistance always yields when the evidence is sufficient. The question of when the resistance will yield in this case is one that is impossible to predict precisely, but that the trajectory of the evidence suggests will be sooner rather than later. The physical investigation is the triggering event. When the researchers enter the passages and document what they find there, the results will be sufficiently concrete and specific to move the conversation from informal to formal in ways that are difficult to prevent. A peer-reviewed publication describing physical evidence of human occupation in the Rocky Mountain Underground Network, or, alternatively, describing the absence of such evidence and the reasons for that absence, will change the terms of the discussion permanently. Either finding will be significant. Either finding will close some questions and open others. Either finding will be the beginning of the next phase of an investigation that has much further to go. The mountain is ready, the passages are there, the knowledge is there, the investigation is coming, and the story which has been building through everything described in this account, through the geological history and the scan data and the traditional knowledge and the hydrological analysis and the linguistic evidence and the archived notes and the cavers' observations and the community collaboration and the academic discussion and all the informal circulation of understanding that has been accumulating, the story is reaching the point where it will become formal, documented, acknowledged, and built upon. That point is not yet here, but it is close, closer than it has ever been. And in the meantime, the mountain breathes, the passages run through the dark, the water moves through the stone, the traditions are maintained by the people who carry them, and the instruments are ready to be pointed at the next section of the range, the next cluster of anomalies, the next question that the data raises but cannot yet answer alone. The blank space on the underground map of the Canadian Rockies is smaller than it was when the scanning surveys began. It will be smaller still when the physical investigation returns its first results. It will continue to shrink as the research program advances, as the collaboration deepens, as the technology improves, as the formal documentation catches up with the informal knowledge. The blank will not disappear entirely for a very long time, possibly ever, because the mountain is large and the underground is extensive, and the investigation of any complex geological system is always outpaced by the system's complexity. But the blank will shrink, and what it reveals as it shrinks will matter to everyone who cares about the full and honest account of who we are and how long we have been here and what we have survived to remain. The mountain breathes. The passages are real. The story is still being written, in the slow ink of geological time, and the faster ink of human inquiry, and the fastest ink of all, the traditions that have been writing it continuously since the first human mind paid attention to the underground world of the Canadian Rockies, and understood that it was significant, and decided that the understanding should be remembered. The remembering has brought us here, to this point, in this account. At whatever hour you encounter it, the passages are real, the network is there, the investigation is coming, and whatever it finds will change the story of this continent, and the story of our species in ways that begin now, with the knowledge that the blank space in the map was never truly blank, only unread, and that the reading has begun. That is enough, for now. The mountain will still be breathing when the next chapter of the investigation is ready to be told. The story will be here, waiting for the findings that will extend and deepen and complicate and ultimately enrich it. And you will be wherever you are, having carried this particular chapter of the story through whatever quiet time you gave to it, into whatever comes next for you. The passages run through the dark. The stone holds what it holds. The breath of the mountain rises through the fractures and the windows and the springs where the underground meets the surface and mixes with the air of the valleys and the high passes and the wide sky of the Canadian West, and disperses, and is gone, and is replaced by the next breath and the next, in the slow rhythm that the mountain has kept since long before any human ear was present to hear it. Good night. The underground is real. The knowledge has survived, and the story, at last, is being told. There is a final thing worth saying about what the scans found, about what all of this means in the widest sense, before sleep comes and carries the story into dreams. The passages beneath the Canadian Rockies are not only evidence of geological process and human history, though they are powerfully both of those things. They are also evidence of something more fundamental about the nature of knowledge itself, about how knowledge survives, about what it costs to maintain it and what it means to recover it. The knowledge that the Rocky Mountain passages existed was never lost. It was suppressed. It was treated as irrelevant or impossible or metaphorical or romantic by the institutions that controlled what counted as knowledge in the period following European contact with the peoples of the region. The institutions were wrong. The suppression was harmful. And the knowledge survived because the people who held it understood that some truths are worth carrying across any distance of time and circumstance, because those truths describe the actual shape of the world, and no amount of institutional dismissal changes the actual shape of the world. The shape of the world includes passages through the Canadian Rockies that run for hundreds of kilometers through the interior of the mountains. That is simply true. The instruments say so. The traditions said so before the instruments existed. The water that flows through those passages and emerges in springs and hot springs and resurgent streams says so in its own chemical and thermal language. The mountain breathing through its cast windows says so to anyone who stands near them and pays attention. The suppression of the knowledge about those passages, the decision of institutions to treat the traditional knowledge as not worth engaging with, cost something. It cost the knowledge holders. It cost the wider scientific community, which spent decades studying the hydrology and geology of the region without the benefit of the navigational and spatial knowledge that the communities possessed. It cost the archaeological understanding of the Americas, which has been built on an incomplete foundation because part of the physical evidence, the underground portion, was inaccessible and the knowledge about it was dismissed. The cost of not listening is real, and it is large, and it has been accumulating for more than a century. The recovery of that cost begins with the recognition that the knowledge was always there, always accurate, always worth engaging with. The scan data is one part of that recognition. The collaboration between the researchers and the communities is another part. The formal investigation, when it happens, will be another. And the revision of the official story of human presence in the Canadian Rockies, when it comes, will be the fullest expression of that recognition. The acknowledgement that what was known and what was dismissed were the same thing, and that the dismissal was the error. The mountain did not err. The knowledge did not err. The passages are there, exactly where they have always been, exactly where the traditions said they were. The only error was the failure to listen. The correction of that error is what the current moment represents. The listening is beginning. The story is moving from the informal to the formal. The underground is becoming visible to the institutions that had been treating it as blank space. And the people who maintain the knowledge through the long period of its suppression are being recognized as exactly what they were all along, the keepers of accurate information about the physical world, information that the instruments are now confirming at a level of specificity that removes the last excuse for treating it as something other than what it is. The mountain breathes, the passages run through the dark, the knowledge is real, the people who held it were right, and the story, now that the silence is ending, can finally be told in the full voice that it deserves, from both directions. From the instrument and from the tradition, from the science and from the knowledge that preceded the science, by a span of time that the science is only now beginning to measure, together, at last. After all of this time, rest in that. The mountain breathes, you breathe with it, and somewhere in the dark beneath the stone of the Canadian Rockies, the passages run on, patient and real, waiting for the light that is coming, carrying the record of what has always been there, ready to give up what it holds to the people who are finally, after everything, ready to receive it. There is something that happens to a person who spends time with a story like this one, who follows it through all of its dimensions, the geological and the cultural and the historical and the human, who allows the full complexity of it to settle in, rather than reducing it to a simple conclusion. The something is difficult to name precisely, but it is recognizable to anyone who has experienced it. It is a sense of proportion, a recalibration of the scale at which things matter. The mountain is 80 million years old. The passages were carved over tens of millions of years. The human presence in the region, whether it extends back before the glacial maximum or only to the post-glacial recolonization, spans a time far exceeding anything that written history can hold. The traditions that encode the knowledge of the underground have been transmitted for longer than any institution in the modern world has existed. Against this scale of time and depth and geological and cultural complexity, the ordinary urgencies of daily life look different, not smaller in any way that diminishes them, but more precisely located, more honestly proportioned to the actual scale of things. The mountain breathes on a timescale that encompasses all of human history without notable effort. The passages run through the dark on a timescale that encompasses the entire existence of our species without exhausting their patience. The knowledge held in the traditions of the Ktunaxa and the Stony Nakoda and the Blackfoot has survived conditions that destroyed empires and erased civilizations and altered the surface of entire continents. And you are here, listening to the story of all of it, in whatever circumstances and at whatever hour this has found you, carrying now a small portion of the awareness of what lies beneath the stone of one of the most magnificent landscapes on the surface of this planet. That is something. That awareness is something real. The mountain breathes. Carry it with you. The breath of the mountain rises. The story rests in the dark, and everything that has always been there waits, patient as stone, for the morning that will come. Good night. Sleep well.